important factor which shapes international politics.
Hello. Today we will talk about a very complex, partly contested, but nevertheless extremely important topic, which is global governance. What is global governance? Global governance, in a very general understanding, is collective management of common, transnational or global problems, which are those problems that were created or exacerbated by globalization, and the problems which cannot be managed at the level of the nation state, by the nation state. So global governance is inseparable from globalization. And management of these problems is provided through a very highly complicated, flexible and rule systems of rules, institutions and processes, and involving huge number of both states and non-state actors. So just to summarize this very general understanding of global governance, it is the management of problems which are created by globalization, management of the problems through rules, institutions and processes, and management which involves both states and non-state actors. What kind of problems does global governance deal with? What are these problems which are created or exacerbated by globalization? Here is their example. They are global climate change and pollution of the environment, poverty and management of economic development, deficit of fresh water in the world, financial instability and management of financial markets, global economic crisis and recessions, management of global trade and investment, global energy market and the instability of global energy, global migrations, pandemics such as the Ebola virus, transnational terrorism, transnational organized crime, and so on and so forth. And indeed, some of those problems are direct products of globalization, such as transnational terrorism, proliferation of extremist ideas and ideology, instability of global financial markets, global economic crisis, and so on and so forth. These problems could not simply exist in the era before globalization. They were created by globalization. It is globalization who make them possible. The other problems that I've mentioned have different origin, but they become real problems of IR, of international relations and security, in conditions of globalization, such as poverty, starvation, or even civil, regional and local wars. Indeed, before globalization, poverty, for instance, or civil wars had low importance except for those who were directly involved in them or impacted by them. Starvation in Africa, poverty in Latin America, civil wars and local wars in some remote lands, it didn't really bother the others, especially great powers. But now, in conditions of globalization, these same phenomena can have and do have very dangerous repercussions for everyone in the world, including most powerful nations. Even most powerful nations cannot resist those trends. And these threats and challenges can result, for instance, in pandemics, which conditions of intense transborder travel can reach other continents in hours. These problems can result in the spread of political extremism, which can in its own turn result in Islamic terrorism, including the so-called catastrophic terrorism, which is the terrorism with the use of nuclear weapons, so weapons of mass destruction, and so on and so forth. Moreover, these problems are interconnected, both geographically and across the problem areas. For instance, the geographical interconnectedness is this, that extremism in one area spills over into extremism in the other areas. The rapid spread of Arab Spring and the rise of Islamist extremism in the Western European countries as a result of the existence of ISIS, Islamic State, thousands of miles away, is a good illustration of this phenomena. People from Europe go to fight in Iraq and Syria at the side of Islamic State, and then they return home and spread the same ideology in the streets of Paris or London or Moscow. But problems are also interconnected across problem areas. For instance, poverty, which is the essentially economic problem, could result in terrorism and Islamic extremism. Water deficit in conditions of globalization can result in regional conflicts, which in their turn also result in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, political extremism, and so on. Once again, Arab Spring can be a very vivid example of this interconnectedness, with one of the reasons, for instance, of the Arab Spring was hot summer of the year 2010, which in its turn is the result of the climate change, and this climate change resulted in the collapse of states, of the non-monarchical Arab states in the Middle East, and triggered the instability of the Arab Spring. And as these problems have become common or global or transnational in conditions of globalization, they can no longer be tolerated and require collective action to be managed. What is common to all those problems that I have enumerated before or mentioned before is that they cannot be dealt with, they cannot be managed at the national level by individual states acting alone. No state acting alone can resolve the turbulence of global economy and water economic crisis. No state acting alone can overcome terrorist challenge or fully protect itself from the transborder diseases. No state, except for instance with North Korea, cannot protect itself from the spread of dangerous ideas and extremist ideologies. Thus, what is needed is collective action, collective management of these problems, and this collective management is basically global governance. So we can make a conclusion that global governance is only about managing problems and issue areas related to globalization and the consequences and effects of globalization. Global governance is not about managing traditional problems of world economy or international relations. It is not about, for instance, adversarial relations among states. It is not about regional and local conflicts as such, and so on and so forth. James N. Rosenau, which is one of the founding fathers of global governance concept, exemplified this phenomena in a phrase which is that we are living in a bifurcated world, right? A bifurcated world of global governance coexisting with the world of traditional international relations. So we live in a bifurcated world, meaning that we live both in a world of states and international relations, where powers compete, promote interest, fight for power and prestige, and so on and so forth, and traditional international relations and global politics takes place. And there is the world of all actors, not just states, but also non-state actors, and global governance. And this world of global governance belongs to management of globalization and to globalization as such, and is about management of the problems of globalization. Just to make it very vivid, for instance, the traditional great power competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not about global governance. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about global governance. The contradictions between Russia and NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the problems of arms control between Russia and the United States of America are not about global governance. They are traditional problems of international relations. Whereas climate change, transnational terrorism, transnational extremist ideology, water deficit, and other problems that I have enumerated before, they are about global governance. And of course, we also need to keep in mind that some repercussions of the traditional conflicts and problems of international relations can become problems of globalization. The problems which are created and strengthened by globalization, such as transnational terrorism, political radicalization, transnational criminal network, they do fit into the realm of global governance. Now, having talked about the general understanding of global governance, let's turn to the forms, formats, and patterns of global governance and how basically global governance is made. As for its forms, formats, patterns, or mechanisms, they could be of virtually any kind. Global governance and these formats can be formal, informal, or mixed. They can comprise both states and non-state actors or be hybrid. They can be institutionalized or not institutionalized, universal or regional, multilateral or unilateral. They can be formal, treaty-based, or informal and ad hoc based. They can be static or flexible in terms of the participants who actually take part in the provision of global governance. Virtually everything that contributes to management of global problems and regulation of behavior of actors relative to global and transnational problems, virtually everything that regulates actors' behavior in a way mitigating or resolving those problems is global governance, refers to global governance. So it is a very vague form, but it is essential, and I think now you get the understanding of what global governance is and that the forms of global governance can be multiple. Now about making of global governance. What is the most usual form of managing or regulating? It is adopting rules. Rules are at the heart, at the core of global governance. Indeed, we govern through rules. We regulate behavior through rules. We encourage actors to obey those rules, and this is why rule-making is at the heart of global governance. As for the type of the rules, they again can be multiple. These rules can be formal, spelled out in treaties, or informal, just informal understandings, informal patterns of behavior. These rules can be imposed from the top by some hegemon, imposing the rules of the behavior of others, or these rules can be elaborated from the bottom, like a self-organization of the actors in the system. The rules can apply to states only, or to non-states actors only, or to both. Such as, for instance, sponsorship of terrorism and management of transnational terrorism implies both states and non-state actors, and both states and non-state actors have to follow certain rules. Rules might require an institution for their provision, monitoring, and implementation, or can exist without institution. For instance, the rule which prohibits proliferation of weapons of mass destruction has the institution which is the International Atomic Energy Agency. But there are also multiple rules that can exist without institution. And all these various forms of rule-making and rule-taking with the purpose of dealing with global problem are global governance. It is also essential to keep in mind that this rule setting and collective management of the common global transnational problems takes place without a supreme authority in the world, without an authority that would be authorized for the management of those problems. Indeed, at the level of nation states, there is such a managing authority. This is the government. And we live in states with the presidents or kings, so we have the state authority. We have police, which forces us to obey those rules. However, at the international level, this government does not exist. All states still remain sovereign. International system remains anarchical, anarchy meaning the absence of supreme authority. Each sovereign state is the supreme authority for its state, for itself. So the conclusion that we have to make, and the very important phenomena that we observe in the international system, that there is governance which really exists, because there is really the elaboration of rules and institutions, but this governance takes place without government, without global government. And this phenomenon is again exemplified by James Rosenau, whom I have already mentioned, who coined the term governance without government. And this governance without government is absolutely essential for understanding the global governance as it exists today in the international system. This concept tells us that there are processes in the international system which are quite reminiscent to the process of governing inside states the process such as rulemaking, rule-taking, and so on. But these processes develop without any world government. And we have to understand very clearly that global governance in no way implies the existence of a global empire of any kind of global state. It is indeed governance without government, without the central authority which exercises this governance top-down. This governance exists by itself in between through horizontal, very multiple, mixed interaction of very many participants, of very many actors. So, concluding this understanding of global governance, this term describes a very new reality, a new phenomena in world politics which occurred because of globalization. What kind of the new phenomena? What does global governance emphasize? It emphasizes a new quality of the international system actually appeared, the greater integrity of the international system. Everything has become interlinked and mutually impacting in conditions of globalization. None of states, including the sole superpower of the United States of America, appear today capable to manage this globalized integral environment in a desired way unilaterally. Secondly, the new reality implies that states' behavior is driven today by transnational and global threats and challenges, not just by the behavior of other states. Before globalization, the major driver of the behavior of states were the other states, the international system. Today, we perceive joint and multilateral management of the new transnational and global problems, which is perceived as necessary. Such as we do have the United States cooperating with China on managing global economy. United States cooperate with Russia on managing global and transnational terrorism, despite the fact that we are adversaries. So behavior of states is determined by these transnational challenges and threats, by transnational factors, not just by the behavior of the other states. Also, the term global governance is used to emphasize relocation of authority, so-called relocation of authority. It is the relocation of authority from states to the other actors. And governance, indeed, the very term governance emphasizes the role of non-state actors and horizontal management, not vertical management. Emphasizes the roles of societies and non-state actors, not just states. Elke Krachman, one of the prominent authors talking about governance and global governance, makes it very clear. And here is the quote from one of his works. Governance, the term governance, presumes fragmentation of political authority and policy functions among governmental and non-governmental actors, and the preference for the market. Preference for the market, not top-down administrative solutions. Governance is thus a concept of fragmented political authority, whereas government is a concept of centralized political authority. This is by the way, we're talking about global governance, not global government. Because global government as a process would imply the top-down rule. Whereas global governance implies horizontal management of shared and common transnational problems. Finally, the term global governance emphasizes that states and other actors create rules. They regulate and exercise authority much more than they did before. And indeed, if we look upon the world politics of today, we might make an impression that states and other actors behave as if there were global government, as if there were the supreme authority in the world. But this global government lacks. So there is the elaboration and the position of rules. There is this exercise of authority on a transnational level, but it takes place without global government. Thus, the term governance, global governance, is necessary to emphasize this new reality. Now you have the general understanding of what global governance is. However, there is no universally accepted definition of global governance. And there are different approaches and different definitions provided by different organizations and scholars. For instance, the Commission on Global Governance, which was established in 1995 under the auspices of the United Nations and produced a very important report, Our Global Neighborhood, defined global governance in the following way: as the sum of many ways individuals and institutions, public and private, manage their common affairs. It is a continuing process through which conflicting or diverse interests may be accommodated and cooperative action may be taken. And indeed, this is a very, very broad definition, which implies that global governance is on the one side a sum of the ways that many actors manage their affairs, and at the same time a process. And this is very important because from the very beginning you have to understand and learn that global governance, this term global governance, implies both institutions and processes. It is kind of institutions, phenomena, and processes at the same time. So this was the definition provided by the UN Commission. However, this did not bring consensus to the academic world. And scholars have different opinions about what global governance is and whether actually it even exists. The founding father, or one of the most prominent scholars who used and advertised and popularized the term global governance, was James Rosenau, an American scholar, and I will come back to him a little bit later in more detail. And in his article, Governance in the New Global Order, published in 2003, James Rosenau provided the following very broad definition to global governance. Quotes, that global governance is the sum of all the diverse efforts of communities at every level to move towards goals while preserving their coherence from one moment in time to the next. It is a summarizing phrase for all the sites in the world where efforts to exercise authority are undertaken. If we follow that definition, then global governance could be virtually anything. Virtually anything. And indeed, Rosenau emphasizes the diverse efforts of communities at every level, so starting with individual, ending with United Nations organization. And he emphasizes all the sites in the world where efforts to exercise authority are undertaken. Another very similar definition of global governance from Rosenau is that global governance are systems of rules at all levels of human activity, from the family to international organization. The systems of rules in which the pursuit of goals through the exercise of control has transnational repercussions. And this is also very helpful to understand what global governance is and what is at the core of global governance. I've mentioned before that the process of governing actually involves creating rules. Thus, Rosenau emphasizes that global governance are systems of rules. And for him, it is systems of rules at all levels of human activity. Quite different definition is provided by another very prominent scholar, Thomas Weiss. For him, global governance are not systems of rules. For him, global governance are efforts. So Weiss emphasizes the behavioral, the procedural aspect of global governance instead of the static component, which is exemplified by Rosenau. So for Thomas Weiss, global governance is efforts to bring more orderly and reliable responses to social and political issues that go beyond the capacities of states to address individually. So very close to what we started with. And also Weiss emphasizes that global governance implies the absence of political authority and the need for collaboration and cooperation among governments and others, meaning non-state actors, who seek to encourage common practices and goals in addressing global issues. And finally, a different example of the definition is provided by Thomas Weiss and Ray Thakur. Ray Thakur is a former UN official. He was the former assistant to the UN General Secretary. Thus, they emphasize the role of institutions, the role of formats, not rules, not processes, but formats, institutions in global governance. And for Weiss and Thakur, global governance is a complex of institutions, mechanisms, relations and processes between and among states, markets, citizens and organizations, both inter and non-governmental, through which collective interests on the global plane are articulated, rights and obligations are established, and differences are mediated. And these several definitions, they really allow you to perceive how different scholars emphasize different aspects of global governance. Some of them emphasize institutions and formats. Others emphasizes processes, behavior, efforts. And third, like Rosenau, emphasizes rules and systems of rules at every level of collectivities. Still, there is no consensus on the idea of global governance, of what actually are we talking about when we mention this term global governance, and there are multiple dimensions in the existing literature. Some, when they talk about global governance, they think they mean international institutions and formats. So for them, global governance is the United Nations Organization, G20, G8, and so on. Others, while talking about global governance, mean global civil society, the non-state actors that perform, that operate at the global and transnational stage. So for them, global governance is like Transparency International, Greenpeace, Human Rights Watch, and the other non-state actors. Others talk about international law. So for them, global governance is the evolution of the rules of the behavior of states, such as the UN Charter, the global trade regime, or the emerging rule of responsibility to protect. For the other group of scholars, global governance actually is about the US hegemony. And indeed, they emphasize that it is the United States which is at the center of the majority of rules and institutions in the international order. And so for them, global governance is kind of the colorful and acceptable cover for what is essentially the American empire, the US hegemony in the world. The others, they talk, while talking about global governance, they mean various wishful hypothetical form of world government, actually. They should be created in their mind in order to provide order for the world. So they talk about the necessity to create a global confederacy or a global empire or some form of the global board of directors. And finally, for the other scholars, global governance is about global markets. And they depict firms and individuals as agents of global governance. One of the most prominent scholars who provided the most valuable contribution to the conceptualizing, theorizing, and study of global governance is American scholar James N. Rosenau. And he, in a series of books and articles, which include his book from 1990, Turbulence in World Politics, A Theory of Change and Continuity, his article from 1995, Governance in the 21st Century, and his book from 1997, Along the Domestic Foreign Frontier, Exploring Governance in a Turbulent World. In this series of publication, Rosenau really established the foundations of the theory of global governance. And he conceptualized the relations between globalization, state, and global governance issues. So in the next section, we will talk about the Rosenau's perception of global governance in a more detailed way, and how does Rosenau perceive the participants of global governance and classification of global governance. As for the participants, James Rosenau provides the following list of collectivities that actually provide governance and thus participate in global governance. Who are these collectivities? According to Rosenau, this is a very, very comprehensive and diverse group of actors, which include, first, subnational and national governments founded on hierarchical structures and formally adopted in constitutions. Secondly, they include for-profit transnational corporations, also formally and hierarchically structured. So, international companies, the transnational and multinational corporations. Third, they include international governmental organizations based on formal treaties and charters, like United Nations, WTO, NATO, and so on. Fourth, these actors include subnational and national for-profit non-governmental organizations, NGOs, sustained by either formal bylaws or informal and undocumented arrangements. Fifth, they include international or transnational NGOs, either formally structured as organizations or informally linked together as associations or social movements, like professional organizations. Organization for Political Scientists, for instance, could be the example of this collectivity. Six, these collectivities, according to Rosenau, include markets. Markets that have both formal and informal structures, which steer horizontal exchanges between buyers and sellers, producers and consumers. Seventh, the participants of global governance include elite groups whose level of formal and informal organization might differ. And finally, the participants of global governance include mass publics that form briefly in response to specific issues and then disband when the issue is settled, such as Occupy Wall Street, right? A very prominent social movement that was created and existed in the United States at the dawn of the Barack Obama's presidency. Now, let's move to classification of global governance according to Rosenau. What types of global governance can exist and do exist in reality? And in order to prepare the classification, Rosenau provides two major variables. Then these two variables are structures of global governance and processes of global governance. The variable structures or patterns of global governance determines how rules are established. Not who, not what kind of actors, the actors we've just mentioned, but how are these rules established? Are they established formally or informally? How authority is exercised in a formal or in informal way? And by the variable processes, Rosenau determines what kind of processes of governance are taking place. For instance, are they top-down or bottom-up? So the processes of governing, let's start with the processes, are actually the nature of governing processes. And according to Rosenau, these natures of governing processes can be of two types. The processes of governance could be linear or unidirectional. This is when the authority is exercised just in one direction, such as top-down or bottom-up. Or these processes can be non-linear or multi-directional, when the process of exercise of authority is so complex that two or more directions can be traced, when there is a sort of feedback. So it can be both top-down and bottom-up and horizontal at the same time, and the movement of authority can be multi-directional. So a linear type process can be either vertical or horizontal, while multi-directional process can be both vertical and horizontal at the same time. Now about structures. The second line of coordinates that Rosenau provides us for the classification of the types of global governance is structures or patterns. As I have said, it is how governance is exercised. And this line, this variable, characterizes essentially formality or informality of rulemaking, a degree to which authority is established formally or it is established informally. Thus, Rosenau divides the structures of governance into three groups: formal, informal, and mixed, which could be both formal and informal structures at the same time. And it is important to keep in mind that the structures criteria does not establish whether this or that collectivity is formal or informal. For instance, state is always formal, but NGO is always informal. It is not established by this criteria because it is clear. But this criteria instead establishes whether this or that exercise of governance is conducted on the formal or informal basis. Whether the cooperative actions that produce rules are done in a formal or in informal way. For instance, the NGO collaboration with the state and state collaboration with the NGO or the transnational corporation. It can be formal or it can be informal. And this is exemplified and analyzed by this structural criteria. And if we combine these structures and processes, we will see the following matrix. And this matrix shows us the types, the possible and existing types of global governance taking place in the world of today. And when we combine these three types of structures, formal, informal, and mixed, and two types of processes, the unidirectional processes and multi-directional processes, we come to conclusion, obviously, that there can exist and do exist in the world 6 major types of global governance. And Rosenau discusses these 6 types of global governance. They are top-down governance, bottom-up governance, market governance, network governance, side-by-side governance, and finally, complex web governance. And in the following section, we will talk about each of them in a more detailed way. Let's start with the unidirectional types of governance. So the unidirectional and formal governance is defined by Jim Rosenau as top-down governance. And this is the most simple and classic, and also most visible one. This is the type of governance which is conducted in domestic politics in the form of state government, whereas at the international level, this top-down governance is done by, for instance, individual states when they impose some rule on the other states, or when they demand a certain pattern of foreign or domestic behavior from the other states. And the example could be, for instance, the US intervention in Somalia in 1993, the US war in Iraq in 2003, Russian war in Georgia in 2008, and so on and so forth. Also, this top-down governance can be conducted by groups of states when they elaborate certain rules and want the others to comply or with these rules, or demand a certain behavior from the others. And the examples could be the intervention of NATO into Kosovo in 1999, or the decisions of the G8 and G20 regarding economic policies and economic financial regulations, and so on. Another prominent example of this top-down governance could be the performance of the UN Security Council vis-à-vis the all other states of the international system. Indeed, when the UN Security Council adopts the resolution, this is the top-down rule. Because all other states, all other member states of the United Nations, they have to obey to these resolutions, otherwise they face sanctions. So as this resolution is adopted by the institution and by the group of states, which are the members, the current member states of the UN Security Council, and then imposed on all the other states, this is exactly the top-down governance. So, top-down governance can be performed by international intergovernmental organizations when the United Nations, WTO, NATO, World Bank, IMF, and other institutions take decisions and impose these decisions on the others. This is top-down governance. And this top-down governance can be exercised even by transnational corporations when they either individually or jointly agree on some standards and then impose these standards on the other actors, or conduct direct provision of public goods somewhere, right? For instance, when transnational corporations open a hospital, or provide jobs in a certain country. So this type of top-down governance is done by formal structures which establish rule and try to make the others to follow this rule. And the collectivities which are involved in this type of governance are states, groups of states, international organizations, and transnational corporations. Now let's move to the second type of unidirectional governance and talk about unidirectional and informal governance. The type of governance which is unidirectional and informal is called bottom-up. Jim Rosenau called it bottom-up governance. It is less visible in terms of dominating the media, but nevertheless it is quite spread. And this bottom-up governance happens when rules are elaborated by such actors as human rights groups, NGOs, and mass public and such, and then transmitted up, bottom-up. These rules are elaborated by non-state actors, and they passed to the states and international organizations to be ratified by governments and international institutions. And there are examples for that. This is really the phenomena which is very widespread. Though eventually states and international institutions are the ones who officially adopt these rules, they are not always those who really elaborate these rules. These rules could be imposed on the states or kind of passed to the states and international organizations by civil society. And sometimes states, due to the considerations of prestige and so on and so forth, simply have no other option than to accept those rules which are really elaborated, created by the non-state actors. The classic example is the Landmines Convention, which was elaborated and lobbied by a series of NGOs and then accepted and officially ratified by the states. Another example is a series of standards for conducting free and fair elections that the organizations like Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Council of Europe adopt. And indeed, as Rosenau describes this situation, quote, governments are mere policy ratifiers at the receiving end of the flow of authorities. The collectivities that participate in this form of governance thus include the NGOs, both national and international NGOs, mass public, which can be mobilized for a certain demand, and governments and international organizations who receive and ratify the impulses of authority from the bottom, from the non-state actors. Finally, the unidirectional and mixed governance. Unidirectional in terms of the process and mixed in terms of structures. This type of governance is defined as market governance by Rosenau. And this type describes informal horizontal flows of authority, such as economic exchanges, but which occur in the framework of formal regulatory mechanisms. And it is quite peculiar that for Rosenau, agreements and contracts between private actors on trade and investment, for instance, is a part of global governance. All these actors establish rules for themselves and for the others. Private companies, transnational corporations establish rules for themselves and for the others. These rules are spelled out in contracts. But these interactions, this rule making, happens in the regulatory framework that is provided by the governments, by the states. Thus, this type of governance process is both formal and informal, in the sense that governance exercise some formal regulation over the informal flows of trade and investment. Let's say Russia-EU contract on gas trade and the impact of the Russian legislature, Russian foreign policy, and the EU's third energy package, and the EU's external energy policy. These are the regulatory framework, but the agreements between gas companies are the private interactions of the companies. And the collectivities of these governance processes are both governments, international organizations involved in global economic governance, and market actors, the companies and individuals. Now, having discussed the unidirectional processes of governance, let's turn to the multidirectional, which are much more complex processes of governance, the processes in which the exercise of authority, the process of governing, can be of any directions, where the authority can go one way and another, vertically and horizontally, where it can originate with one actor, but then proceed with the other factors and return to the initiator and so on. So the multidirectional and formal governance is defined by Jim Rosenau as network governance. This involves primarily formal interactions among formally organized collectivities of various nature, such as governments, international organizations, formally organized NGOs, and formally organized business alliances and associations, which at this very situation act as equals. It is not a vertical interaction between governments and other governments, or governments and NGOs. They participate in the network governance as equals. So their interaction lacks hierarchy. It is horizontal by nature and based on the network principle. But these networks are formal and visible. Just to give several examples, one of the examples of this network governance could be the first major climate change conference, the 1992 World Environmental Climate Change Conference in Rio de Janeiro, or the latest climate change summit in Paris. The participants of this summits represented both governments and NGOs, and proposals from the leaders of states and from non-state delegations triggered immediate counter-proposals, shifting coalitions, and so on and so forth. For instance, in Copenhagen climate change conference, the European Union tried to act on par with the United States, but eventually happened to be sidelined. The United States originally tried to act in a coalition with Europe, but in the end struck a deal with China. Rosenau calls these shifts of coalitions and the fluctuations of the exercise of authority as feedback loops. Feedback loops, meaning that we make a certain action, we exercise an authority, but we get a feedback. There is a loop in the process of feedback. It returns to us and triggers another action on our side. So the process of governance goes both ways and several ways at the same time. Another example of the network governance could be the performance of G20. In the organization of the G20, of the 20 major economic countries, there is no hegemon. It is neither the US-dominated institution nor a China-dominated institution. And the process of rule-making within G20 is indeed a horizontal collaboration of all the major states. Another example of the network governance is the performance of the UN Security Council within itself. The interaction of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. There is no hegemon among themselves. Russia and China do not follow the commands of the United States within the UN Security Council and vice versa. Thus, the performance of this council is based on horizontality, on the interaction among the countries which are based on the principle of diplomatic parity. Flexible multilateral diplomacy and ad hoc groups, such as Middle Eastern Quartet, managing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the groups of 6 of negotiators on the problems of Iran, nuclear program of Iran, and the nuclear program of North Korea, are also the examples of this network governance. In this, there was no hegemon in the group of 6 dealing with the Iranian nuclear issue. There were the United States, Europe, Russia, and they were compelled to act on a horizontal, equal level. The same with North Korea, where there is no hegemon in this group. So actors in network governments, what are they? They are governments or states, international organizations, NGOs, and association of NGOs. Another type of multidirectional governance is when we have multidirectional processes of governance, but of informal nature. And this informal multidirectional governance is defined by James Rosenau as side-by-side governance. This governance arises out of informal cooperative interactions among transnational non-governmental elites on the one hand and state officials on the other hand. These interactions and interchanges are so thorough and effective that the distinction between formal and informal inputs, between who actually governs, whether it is state officials or informal elites, who actually propose this or that act of governance, this or that actually rule, this distinction disappears. And the two become intertwined and indistinguishable, right? The state officials and informal elites become intertwined and indistinguishable in the processes of governance. So the crucial difference between side-by-side governance and network governance can be the following, that if the network governance informs formal collectivities, the former, the side-by-side governance, is based on informal elite groupings. The global effort to combat corruption and the activity of Transparency International may serve as the example of this side-by-side governance. This organization avoids provoking mass publics and prefers to work closely and cooperatively with both governments and international organizations. Thus, Transparency International works with the United States, the EU, and the EU member states, with the United Nations Development Programme, World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund on the one hand, and sometimes with officials from those countries that are considered to be corrupt, and from the NGOs on the other hand as well. And the result is that fight against corruption has become part and parcel of the developmental policies of both developed countries and the international development organizations. So who exercise authority in this case actually is hard to say in the performance of Transparency International. Another example of side-by-side governance could be the high-level panels and commissions, in which both high-level state officials and experts and NGO leaders participate, and which are considered to formulate the agenda of crucial dimensions of world politics and politics of major power centers. The examples of these high-level centers could be Trilateral Commission, bringing together the US, Europe, and Japan, Munich Security Conference, which is the first and major, the most important security arrangement in the world, taking once a year in February in Munich. They hold regular meetings behind closed doors with participation of the high-level state officials and discuss global trends and how to react to global trends, what should be the main tendencies of world politics. So we can say that this is the shadow elites, the shadow, decision-making process of the global governance. And the collectivities which are involved in this form of governance include primarily NGOs, influential individuals, Henry Kissinger, for instance, or George Soros, and the state governments. And the final and the most complex type of global governance, according to Jim Rosenau, is the so-called complex web governance, which is a type which involves multidirectional and mixed governance. Multidirectional in terms of processes and mixed in terms of structures. This is the most complicated type of the global governance processes. It is a combination of network governance and side-by-side governance, and it occurs when government impulses derive from networked interactions of actors from different levels of different natures, including states, elites, NGOs, international organizations, mass publics, and so on and so forth. So we can say that this complex wealth governance is the accumulation of all the previous types of governance that we've discussed all together. This is multidirectional, mixed, formal-informal mode of governance that mobilizes the contribution of all actors from public, private, and social sectors as producers of governance. And their interactions are so diverse and sophisticated that they constitute a hybrid an immensely complicated structure in which the dynamics of governance looks like a web. So the difference between side-by-side governance and complex web governance is twofold. First, complex web governance involves an even greater complexity. And secondly, it involves a resort to mobilization of the mass publics and elites. It is no longer a shadow governance, but quite often quite public, which aims to mobilize the more actors the better of various nature to achieve common purposes. And this form of governance includes almost everyone: states, international organizations, transnational corporations, NGOs, mass publics, and elites. As for examples of this complex web governance, it could be, the perfect example could be the governance of environment. First, governance of environment, of global climate change, encompasses networks of actors at subnational, national, transnational, and international levels. Secondly, all these networks interact in such diverse way that it is absolutely impossible to figure out which particular actor causes which particular process, or who exercises this or that authority, or who is behind this or that rule. Here we have elements of bottom-up, top-down, as well as network governance. States and NGOs form networks of governance on this issue among themselves and across themselves of formal and informal nature. And these networks elaborate norms that are then transformed into rules and thus become elements of governance. Some cases that we usually regard as bottom-up, such as the adoption of human rights and democratic standards, can also turn out to be complex web governance. On the one hand, the NGOs lobby the United States, OSCE, and the Council of Europe, and we've discussed that before. But on the other hand, the adoption of these rules cannot be analyzed separately from the United States and EU interest in the democracy promotion and how these interests play in each particular situation. Finally, elaboration of the rules is rarely just an imposition on the part of the NGOs. It is a networked horizontal collaboration of governments and NGO representatives within the OSCE, for instance, which is side-by-side governance. So accumulation of all these types of governance brings us the complex web governance. Now let's talk about some cases of the exercise of global governance. And it would be absolutely mistaken to claim that global governance is all-encompassing or pervasive or super effective. Certainly, transnational challenges and threats, they do exist. But the ability of states to struggle with them, to manage them, is quite limited. And this limited nature of global governance results from the most profound contradictions of the world of today, which is that whereas the challenges, the international context become truly global, the responses to these challenges remain national. So there is the profound contradiction between the national essence of policies, because we still live in the world of states, and the global nature of challenges and threats. And the vivid illustration of this gap between global challenges and national responses is the issue of transnational terrorism. So let's discuss this case of counterterrorism and global governance of counterterrorism. Transnational or global terrorism, such as the terrorism posed by such organizations as the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, could be one of the best objects of global governance. It is indeed the most vivid case of globalization's dark side, a truly transnationally dispersed challenge presented predominantly by network-organized non-state actors who operate across borders. And by its nature, global terrorism is a transnational challenge that can affect any country. But at the same time, no one can successfully address this unilaterally. Alas, Despite this objective existence of transnational terrorism and the vulnerability of all the states to this challenge, the real performance of global governance of transnational terrorism remains at best sporadic, fragmented, contradictory, and weak. On the one hand, there are many rules and measures adopted by the international institutions and global governance forums aimed at fighting terrorism. So we can't say that global governance of terrorism is zero. No, there were some efforts and there are some results in the global governance of counterterrorism. There are many rules. Many of these rules adopted at the UN and other levels, they constitute important elements of the international law, such as the 14 UN conventions that were adopted since 1963 up to 2010 on preventing terrorism and its various aspects and driving forces, and many UN Security Council resolutions also exist on preventing and fighting terrorism. Many states proclaim counterterrorism to be crucial, if not central dimension of their national security policies, and adopt additional measures and rules to prevent terrorist acts. Finally, there are global governance institutions established specifically to fight international terrorism, such as the United Nations Counterterrorism Commission. On the other hand, the general level of global governance of counterterrorism is far from being satisfactory. It is not. For instance, international community has succeeded in elaborating many specific rules and regulations regarding particular forms of terrorism, such as nuclear terrorism, hijacking of airplanes, and so on, but it has failed to elaborate the comprehensive understanding of international terrorism, and the comprehensive rules of counterterrorism are still lacking. The comprehensive convention of international terrorism is absent now and unlikely to appear in the observable future, despite the universal understanding of its effectiveness. And another prominent example of the non-satisfactory state or the fragmentary state of global governance of counterterrorism is that states actually are reluctant to cooperate on counterterrorism if they have interstate contradictions, if their relations are contradictory. Let's take the example of Syria and Iraq. In Syria and Iraq, we were facing the most terrible terrorist organization of all times up to now. It is the Islamic State, with all its brutality and barbarian practices. However, Russia and the United States, who declared fight against ISIS as the major driving force behind their interventions in Iraq and Syria, failed really to cooperate on counterterrorism. The US-Russian relations in Syria were much more about rivalry, but in the cooperative aspect, they were much more about deconfliction. So deconfliction instead of cooperation was taking place. And the major difficulty in this counter-terrorist governance lies not with the institutions or arrangements of global governance, but of course with the nation states themselves, with the share of compatibility of national counter-terrorist policies, and this share is not really high. And the major impediments for successful governance of counter-terrorism could be distributed into three groups of factors. The first major difficulty is that states fail really to agree upon the definition and identification of transnational terrorism. Who are international terrorists? Of course, we do agree about such extreme cases as the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, but going beyond that, there is no much unanimity among the major countries of the world. For instance, the United States define Hezbollah and Hamas as one of the major international terrorist organizations, whereas Russia fails to attribute Hezbollah into the list of terrorist organizations. What for some states are international terrorists, for the others are freedom fighters and quite legitimate actors that fight for their self-determination. And there are lots of examples of that in the world. So if we fail even to identify international terrorists, to define, to agree about who are and who are not the international terrorists, of course, it prevents successful management of this threat. The second major impediment, we disagree about how to fight transnational terrorism, even if we agree about who are terrorists and who actually exemplifies the terrorist threat. There are several ways of dealing with the transnational terrorist threat. One is dealing with the consequences. It is the actual elimination of terrorists and physical destruction of the terrorist infrastructure. And the second is basically development policies. It is dealing with the reasons. It is preventing the international terrorists to occur. And it deals with much more socio-economic, political, and social issues. It is the prevention of extremism as political and religious ideology. And usually, well, ideal situation would be combine these two dimensions of counterterrorism. But it is not always the case. Sometimes the states prefer to deal with the consequences. They prefer just assassination of individuals and destruction of the terrorist infrastructure. And these actions, they actually exacerbate the problem of the roots of terrorism. Because if, let's say, the United States conduct counter-terrorist strikes at the territories of sovereign countries such as Pakistan or Iraq or Syria, this causes a huge sense of resentment among the local population. They see it as aggression against their sovereignty. They see it as a Christian crusade against the Muslim population. And this actually strengthens the Islamic extremism, which in its turn results to terrorism. And the final impediment against the successful and efficient global governance of counterterrorism is the general relations among states. If the relations among states are bad, and more so confrontational and adversarial, it is quite unlikely that they would be eager to establish counter-terrorist cooperation. If the contradictions among states clearly overwhelm the commonality of their interests in the sphere of counterterrorism, they would be reluctant to cooperate. You know, counterterrorism involves the cooperation among militaries, cooperation among intelligence communities, among special services. And these special services and militaries would be absolutely reluctant to cooperate with the partner whom they regard as adversary. If they are trained to undermine this partner, it is absolutely reluctant. They would be eager to cooperate on counterterrorism. And this is also the reason why, let's say, Russia and the United States have difficulties in cooperating on counterterrorism. Russia has even supplied some information to the United States about international terrorist threat, but the American intelligence was reluctant to believe this information because of the general mistrust in the US-Russian relations. It is so in the US-Russian relations. It is even more so in, let's say, relations between Israel and Iran. They are clearly adversaries. Or Iran and Saudi Arabia, they would not cooperate on counterterrorism. And that would pose serious limitations on the ability to provide effective counterterrorist governance. So the perspective and policies of states diverge in each of these questions that we've covered. States disagree about who are international terrorists. States disagree about how to fight against international terrorists, and states can have bad adversarial and mistrustful relations, and this state of affairs prevents the effective global governance of counterterrorism. Finally, let us talk about the skeptical and critical perceptions on global governance. As you saw from the previous parts of the lecture, global governance is quite important, quite widespread, and quite developed as a concept. However, there are those in the international relations theory who either criticize global governance and identify some flaws in the conceptual framework and the practical implementation, and there are those who basically reject global governance as something artificial and non-existent. And let's start from the latter. Indeed, the concept of global governance is simply flawed for those experts and scholars who believe in state classical sovereignty and self-help international system. For them, the very idea of global governance, which implies that there is something beyond state, that there are some processes of or authorities that states comply with, is impossible. This concept contradicts to the classical idea of sovereignty as the highest authority, and that there is nothing higher authority above states than the states themselves. There are also less extreme views among the opponents of global governance, those who agree that behavior of states is regulated, that states follow certain rules, but according to them, this is not because of global governance. And for these skeptics, the term global governance is unnecessary because the fact that states are willing or compelled to follow certain rules is already conceptualized by traditional theories and concepts of international relations, and thus the new concept of global governance is simply artificial and unnecessary. So what is this concept in traditional theory of IR which explains the fact that states actually follow certain rules? This is regulation. And regulation is a traditional term describing making states complying with certain rules and habits and patterns. And according to the traditional theory of international relations, there are two major sources of regulation. These are balance of power on the one hand, and on the other hand, hegemony. Balance of power determines one type of state behavior. Hegemony predetermines the other type of state behavior, but they both are drivers of regulation. And let's take the example of the Cold War. In the time of the Cold War, there were both balance of power and hegemony as the driver of foreign policies of states. The relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were determined by balance of power, whereas the policies between the US and its allies and the relations between the Soviet Union and Soviet allies were determined by hegemony. And the concept of regulation is traditionally supplemented in the theory of international relations by the concepts and studies of order and regimes. So regulation is perceived as a process, whereas order is a state of affairs to which regulation results. And what is order in the theory of international relations? It is such a system of international relations in which states, they recognize a certain distribution of power and follow certain rules, and these rules and patterns of behavior could be monitored and fastened by certain institutions. From this perspective, really, the concept of global governance is unnecessary. However, what is different from the traditional regulations and global governance? So what is the counter-argument of the proponents of global governance theory? It is that the term regulation does not encompass the globalization and effects of globalization. That globalization is something more, and global governance is something more than balance of power and hegemony, and thus global governance is a necessary conceptual tool which helps us to explain the pattern of behavior of actors in conditions of globalization. That it is much more than just the behavior in accordance with balance of power or in accordance with hegemony. Moreover, the proponents of global governance argue to these critics that, and to the skeptics, that unlike regulation, global governance implies the participation of non-state actors. And this is very important. Indeed, the concept of regulation just explains us regulation of states, of foreign policies of states, Whereas, as you remember from the previous parts of the lecture, global governance by definition implies the other actors and the other participants in addition to states, non-state actors, transnational organizations, and so on and so forth. Another very important point of criticism towards the global governance concept that it undermines the role of states, that it underestimates the role of states and state sovereignty in conduct of international relations and foreign policies of these states. And indeed, despite the development of many formats and forms, global governance can hardly challenge the central role of sovereign state in the international system. Sovereignty implies that only a state can regulate within its own jurisdictional space. And after all, non-state actors, they do participate within the jurisdictional space of sovereign states. Secondly, because regulations must be implemented within states to be effective and enforced, states must agree to regulate. So it all comes to the role of states. And enforcement of regulations also rely to the judicial and policy powers of states. Here is the chart which exemplifies the role of nation states in the production of global governance and international relations. You see, according to this critical viewpoint, nation states, they shouldn't be just one among many. Nation states, they are still at the center of the provision of authorities. It is the nation state which regulates the international organization. The nation state regulates local politics. Nation states regulates civil society. And nation states regulate regions, the regional aspect of integration, such as the European Union. So the critics disagree with a unstoppable relocation of authority from states to non-state actors, according to which Jim Rosenau talks about, and according to which nation states, become one of many participants of global governance on the same equal basis. According to them, nation state is still at the center and will continue to be at the center of both international relations and global governance. And another aspect of criticism towards global governance is not conceptual but practical. This part of criticism does not question global governance as such, does not question this new reality of global governance and phenomena of global governance, but they focus on certain flaws of global governance, certain deficiencies of global governance. And these deficiencies are of two major aspects. One is that in practice, institutions and formats of global governance are strongly influenced by the United States, European Union, and Japan, the developed countries. For instance, the head of the World Bank is always American. The head of the IMF is always the European. We don't see any Chinese or Indians there. Structural adjustment policies reflect the neoliberal Washington consensus of the 1990s, which gives advantage to the capital and developed countries. International regulations governing commercial aircraft and flight are largely drawn from the American regulations. So, yes, global governance is about rules, but who actually imposes these rules? Who elaborates these rules? And the critics say that it is the United States, still the Western countries, the traditional West, which is at the center of rule making. Thus, global governance becomes a certain cover for the Western hegemony. And the question that these critics ask is whether global governance is really global or it serves according to the national interests of most powerful states. So this is the first criticism of the practical aspects. And finally, the second and mostly profound aspect of criticism is that global governance remains fragmented and sporadic. Very few things are really done in terms of provision of global governance. Look upon the state of the global governance of climate change. Look at the state of global governance of the global economy. Look at the state of global governance of transnational terrorism. Yes, certain efforts are made in order to accomplish this governance. But alas, these efforts are far, far beyond from what is necessary for the effective management of those transnational problems. In this lecture, we've covered both theoretical and practical aspects of global governance. For more information, please refer to the presentation provided and the bibliography, the list of literature which is included into this presentation. Thank you very much. Hello. Today we will talk about evolution of realist theory in the 21st century. In particular, after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in conditions of globalization. The thing is, these three events and the overall profound transformation of the international system in late 20th, early 21st century made a fundamental challenge to the classical realism, to the political realism of Hans Morgenthau and neorealism, structural realism of Kenneth Waltz. Neither of them could really either predict or explain these profound transformations of the international system and were at odds with the later development of the IR in the 19th century. However, since the second half of 2000s, and especially in 2010s, the relevance of realism started to revive. So let's talk about how realist theory was challenged by these transformations in late 20th century and how realism evolved afterwards. So the end of the Cold War was a fundamental challenge for the realist paradigm, for the realist thinking. The thing that is that realists, both classical realists, political realists, and neorealists, could not even foresee or predict or explain the rapid conclusion of the Cold War in 1989. According to the structural realists, the Cold War would proceed for an indefinite future. Structural realism claimed that Cold War was a stabilizing force, a stabilizing factor in the international system. It prevented major wars among great powers, and indeed, in conditions of the Cold War, there was neither direct military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, nor major clashes among either great powers. And as late as 1988, Kenneth Waltz, who is the creator of structural realism, argued that the Cold War, quote, was firmly rooted in the structure of post-war international politics and will remain as long as the structure endures, end of the quote. However, despite these predictions and despite the realist assertions that the Cold War made international systems stable, the Cold War ended next year. In 1989, there was a collapse of the Berlin Wall, followed by the US-USSR summit at Malta. And as a result of the Malta summit, Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush Sr. declared the Cold War confrontation to be end. And very soon in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. So the traditional realists, the classical realists, were completely unprepared for these events, and they could not simply explain it. It was indeed in late 1980s, the Soviet foreign policy started a profound change, which the realist theory could not simply explain. What kind of change? First, the Soviet Union allowed a non-violent collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and dismantlement of the empire that the Soviet Union has been sustaining since 1940s. Usually, great powers don't do that. And realists claimed, as back as 1988, that it was unthinkable for the Soviet Union to allow simply a disappearance of its empire without a single shot. But it happened. And Soviet Union, when all the anti-communist transformation started in Central and Eastern Europe, Mikhail Gorbachev claimed that it will not intervene. It will not try to somehow stop or prevent these events from the further evolution. And Gorbachev invoked the so-called Sinatra doctrine, in accordance to the famous song by Frank Sinatra, My Way. He claimed that he's doing his way, unlike the previous Soviet governments did, and he allows the Central and Eastern Europeans to follow their way. It was bizarre. It was simply beyond the logic of political realism and neorealism. Moreover, the Soviet Union allowed a reunification of Germany on the basis of West Germany and within NATO. Again, it was completely impossible to explain it from the realist viewpoint, because what actually happened was that East Germany, which was the Soviet satellite, ceased to exist and joined the West Germany. And this all happened within the NATO alliance. So basically, NATO enlarged, NATO extended in year 1990, when Germany became reunified, to the territory of East Germany. Previously, the long-term position of the Soviet government was that Germany could be unified only through becoming neutral. It should follow the path of Austria and Finland if it wants to become a unified. However, Soviet Union allowed unification of Germany within NATO. It was again a profound challenge to the realist viewpoint upon foreign policy and how the international system should evolve. And finally, in the year 1991, the Soviet Union supported the United States war in the Persian Gulf against Iraq. For the first time in 4 decades, the Soviet Union supported American use of force. And all these events, all these profound transformations, and the rapid conclusion of the Cold War, which became the consequence of this rapid transformation, became just terra incognita for the realists. They simply could not explain this course of events. Next thing that the realists could not explain was the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself, which followed the end of the Cold War. End of the Cold War happened in 1989. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And this triggered even more criticism towards the realist approach, because the criticism was that realism is no longer relevant because it fails to explain the new political reality. Indeed, neither classical political realism nor structural realism were able to explain the Soviet retreat and collapse in just 3 years after Kenneth Waltz had claimed that the Cold War and the Soviet Union will survive for very, very long time, for a long while. No one among the classical realists could explain dissolution of the Soviet Union in conditions of no major war. And in conditions when the Soviet Union remained military superpower. Because structurally, Soviet Union was very strong, very powerful in late 1980s, and there was no profound difference between the position of the USSR in 1988, 1989 and before. The Soviet Union remained the nuclear superpower. The Soviet Union possessed the vast military preponderance over NATO in Central Europe. Soviet economy was still one of the largest economies in the world. Soviet Union maintained the vast system of allies. It enjoyed global presence as the United States. And without a major war, it simply disappeared. These events normally do not happen in international relations. And realism turned out to be completely useless and powerless in terms of explanation. Finally, realists offered false predictions about the post-Cold War development of international relations in many regions, in particular in Europe, and in particular in the short-term prospect. Realists, as I said, were unprepared for the end of the Cold War. But when the end of the Cold War happened, they considered this a very destabilizing event. Again, they assumed that the Cold War was stable, and the end of the Cold War must have resulted in a profound destabilization of the international system. In particular, realists predicted a return of traditional great power confrontation among European countries, such as between Germany and France, France and Britain, Britain and Germany. Realists predicted, for instance, the revival of German imperialism after the end of the Cold War, and chaos and violence in Eastern Europe, where a power vacuum emerged after the Soviet retreat. For instance, one of the most profound realists, John Mearsheimer, argued in one of his articles that, quote, the West has an interest in maintaining the Cold War order and hence has an interest in maintaining the Cold War confrontation, and moreover, the West should support the continued existence of the Soviet Union with substantial military presence in Eastern Europe, because otherwise, the key factor of the Western consolidation, the existence of the Soviet threat, would disappear, and therefore the disappearance of this threat will lead to a conflict between the Western states. So the solution of the Soviet Union, according to John Mearsheimer, must have resulted, or was likely to result, in reemergence of conflicts, traditional historical conflicts between Western countries. But nothing like that happened in Europe. Germany stayed peaceful. Germany did not return to its pre-1945 pattern of foreign policy. No kind of great power contradiction re-emerged in Europe between France and Germany, Germany and Britain, Britain and France. And with the exception of former Yugoslavia, which really collapsed and turned into bloody chaos and was, no profound destabilization happened in Central and Eastern Europe. Central and Eastern Europeans very quickly resolved their territorial disputes and, well, stayed peaceful and integrated quite quickly into the Western Euro-Atlantic institutions. Another fundamental challenge to classical realism and neorealism was the emergence of the unipolarity of the United States, of the unipolar structure in the international system after the end of the Cold War and dissolution of the Soviet Union. The thing is that unipolarity is perceived as a highly unusual and unnatural structure of the international system from the perspective of realists. Realists believe in the balance, in the natural tendency of the international system to establish balance, whereas unipolarity is an apex of unbalance in the international system. However, in reality, the world in 1992, after the collapse of the USSR, really looked unipolar. The first to declare unipolarity was the American scholar and journalist Charles Krauthammer, who coined in his Foreign Affairs article in 1990-91 the term unipolar moment. Unipolar moment, as describing of the unique moment of international system emerging after the end of the Cold War. And at that time, indeed, the United States enjoyed a vast preponderance over all the other countries in the world in the majority of fields of power. The US was economically very strong. The US was militarily the sole superpower. The United States enjoyed universal values and exercised universal values. It enjoyed technological advancement over the other countries and was culturally very attractive. So indeed, no one in the world could be comparable to the United States at that time. And emergence of this unipolar moment immediately triggered debates about how stable and durable will it be. In other words, In other words, whether the United States, as the sole superpower, will be able to ensure international peace and stability and prevent or at least postpone a new wave of great power competition. Liberals did not have problems in explaining this and agreeing with the unipolar stability. And in general, liberal paradigm was much better prepared to explain the fundamental transformations of late 1980s, early 1990s. They did explain the end of the Cold War, they did explain the collapse of the USSR, and they also did explain the unipolar moment and argued and tried to prove that unipolar moment, that US global hegemony was possible, stable, and durable. Liberal internationalists within the liberal camp argued that in order for the United States to preserve its hegemony, it needs to be benevolent and exercised multilaterally, which means it should be exercised through rules and institutions rather than unilaterally. It should be based on universal values, cultural appeal and technological advance of the United States, and such kind of multilateral benevolent exercise of the US hegemony will make it more acceptable and legitimate for the majority of the countries in the world, and thus the US hegemony will be much more stable than the previous hegemonies in history. Neoconservatives, another angle of the liberal camp, claimed from their perspective that unipolarity is also stable and can be durable if the United States preserves power preponderance above all the other countries, above all the rest, and, which is more important from the neoconservative viewpoint, uses this window of opportunity, this unipolar moment, to rapidly and resolutely transform the world in accordance with American values and interests. Which means, for instance, transform rogue states, countries like North Korea, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Libya at that time, Yugoslavia under Slobodan Milosevic and others, from authoritarian anti-American states to democracies. So if the United States conducts this profound transformation of the international system in a quick and resolute way, it will ensure stability and durability of its hegemony and unipolarity. As for the realists, they were quite concerned about this unipolar moment, and they had difficulties in explaining it. In general, the realist camp was split on the issue of stability and durability of the unipolar moment. Structural realism, since it considered bipolarity, not unipolarity, as the most stable configuration of international politics, it claimed that the emergence of this vast disbalance of the unipolar structure might be even more dangerous than the Cold War, than the age of nuclear deterrence. This, of course, sounded quite bizarre and, to say at least, unusual in the post-Cold War period, when the majority of people were talking about the era of peace, the era of prosperity, the era of integration. It was bizarre to hear that realists at the same time were talking that this new age is even more dangerous than the Cold War, when everyone, made a sign of relief when the Cold War ended. To tell the truth, this realist assertion that the unipolar world was much more dangerous than the bipolar Cold War was quite bizarre at that time. The whole population made a big sign of relief when the Cold War ended. The Cold War assumed a constant threat of total nuclear annihilation. And in conditions when almost everyone, or the majority of scholars, observers, and politicians were talking about the new era of peace, the new world order, the new era of cooperation and integration, realists who talked about that this new period is, in their opinion, is much more dangerous than the Cold War, they sounded quite bizarre. However, they made this case. For instance, Kenneth Waltz, the founding father of structural realism, claimed that hegemony, and he defined hegemony as a single power's possession of simultaneous economic efficiency in production, trade, and finance, he claimed that this hegemony is the most unstable international structure because superiority of one single power would unavoidably cause resistance of the others. So according to Kenneth Waltz, emergence of unipolarity could result in the war of all against the United States. Christopher Lane, another prominent realist, argued that the new great powers will emerge soon, that great power conflict is unavoidable, it will come rather sooner than later, and thus unipolarity is not even a moment, it is an illusion. However, there also were some realists who accepted the proposition of the unipolar structure and claimed that unipolarity could be stable and durable. Among them, there were Robert Gilpin, the creator of the so-called liberal hegemonic stability theory, and William Walford, another very renowned American scholar. They argued that under certain conditions, hegemonic predominance may be more stable than the bipolar world. William Walford, from his position, claimed that unipolar structure was more peaceful and durable than was bipolarity because it prevents great power competition and compels the second-tier countries to pursue bandwagoning strategies rather than balancing strategies. After all, the bipolar structure presumed a constant contradiction and clash among the USSR and Soviet Union. They balanced each other, they competed against each other, and great power competition was there always. There was no great power war, but there was an outright and fundamental great power competition. And Walford claimed that unipolarity excludes great power competition, basically because there is only just one great power, the United States, and that's it. And no one else can compete with the United States, no one can challenge the United States in the unipolar structure. Balancing strategies, if they are attempted by the others against the United States, would lead to their destruction. So rational behavior excludes balancing, and the only choice for all the rest is to bandwagon, which means to join the United States. And according to Walford, the United States should conduct active hegemonic policies and actively prevent emergence of rivals in order to keep this power gap between itself and all the rest, and thus ensure durability of the unipolar world. And these points were argued in a very famous classical article by William Walford, Stability in the Unipolar World. Robert Gilpin, from his perspective, applied the hegemonic stability theory, which he developed before, to the new unipolar realities, and argued that American hegemony might and should be stable and durable if it is based on just, fair norms and institutions, and if hegemon conducts self-restraint. So you see, the propositions, the advice that Gilpin and Walford gave were opposite. Walford was talking about the necessity of the US to conduct a very active hegemonic policies. Gilpin claimed that the United States should instead conduct restraint, but they both accepted the possibility of the unipolar world to be stable and durable. Another fundamental and crucial factor that classical realism could not explain was globalization. Liberalism, on the contrary, was very efficient and effective in terms of explaining globalization and the changes that globalization brought to the world. Realism, unfortunately, couldn't. The thing is, globalization and global economic interdependence was completely beyond the realist paradigm. Realist paradigm which focuses on polarity and the role of military power. Globalization brought economic interdependence, economic connectivity, internationalization of production, and the new state of the world, completely different from the considerations of polarity and classical national interests. One of the effects of globalization was the emergence of global governance, cooperation among states on managing the transnational, globalized fields of life, spheres of life, such as managing global climate change, managing global finance, managing global terrorism and conducting global counter-terrorist policies, managing the preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and so on and so forth. And this cooperation was so difficult for realism to explain, because realism explains cooperation first as an exception to the norm of international conduct. The norm for realism is conflict. And it was difficult for realism to explain it because it was beyond the understanding of narrow national interests. If you might remember, we discussed it at one of the previous lectures, that according to realism, states engage in cooperative behavior only when they see that their relative gains will be bigger than the relative gains on the others. Whereas cooperation on the management of the consequences of globalization was completely different from this logic. States engaged in cooperation on the management of globalization despite any relative gains. And even the question of relative gains is absent here, right? Who will gain more or less from preventing global climate change, for instance, right? We will all gain. Globalization and emergence of global transnational challenges, such as global climate change and international finance and international terrorism, or spread of diseases and pandemias like SARS, for instance, or Ebola virus in Africa, they simply put the question of relative gains beyond the brackets. And even the concept of transnational threats and challenges is completely new and completely difficult for realism to reconcile with. For according to the realist classical perspective, all the challenges can be only national. All the challenges are the challenges that some powers make to the other powers, not the challenges provided by globalization. So realism turned out to be without any methodological and analytical tools to explain globalization. Secondly, realism was very difficult in terms of explaining the consequence of globalization, such as the relative decline of the role of military power in world politics. According to realism, according to the realist worldview, the major aspect of power is always military. Why? Because it is military power which ensures survival. Survival is more important. Even if people eat grass, the consideration of survival of state is more important than food, right? Or better food, or is more important than the well-being of the people. So according to realist concept, military power is much more important than economic power. But the realities of the world in late 1980s, early 1990s, and in conditions of globalization were otherwise, were different. It was economic power which ensured the rise of China. It was economic power which ensured preponderance of the United States and American attractiveness and American technological advance over the other powers. Again, let's come back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a military superpower, but it collapsed. And its military preponderance, its nuclear weapons could not prevent the Soviet collapse. It collapsed because of domestic issues and economic issues. So economic power turned out to be at least no less important and perhaps even more important than military power in world politics. This is grasped by liberalism, but it was not grasped by realism. Another consequence of globalization that realism could not simply explain and even could not reconcile with was transformation of state sovereignty as a consequence of globalization. Indeed, since 1990s, in conditions of globalization, it became absolutely evident that not just sovereignty of small, weak, or failing states had troubles, but that all countries in the world, including even the United States, the only superpower, all the major great powers have problems with state sovereignty. That in conditions of globalization, states can no longer control the flow of ideas. States can no longer ensure their external security. You can't do it traditionally in conditions of international terrorism. States could no longer ensure their internal security and safety. Transnational organized crime is the reason. States could no longer even ensure maintenance of themselves as the undisputed centers of legitimacy, because people started to give their legitimacy to some other poles of authority, such as international terrorist organizations, for instance. And thus transformation of state sovereignty started. It is just absolutely evident, and it is difficult even to quarrel with it and to argue against. Domestic politics has become a very strong part of the international relations agenda, and we are no longer in the world when a violation of sovereignty and intervention into domestic affairs is considered and accepted as the root violation of international conduct. We all discuss domestic politics of each other. We all interfere into domestic politics of each other. The majority of conflicts in the world are about domestic affairs of states, internal troubles rather than external troubles. The majority of wars that occur today in the international system are civil wars that happen inside the countries rather than interstate wars among states. State sovereignty started to transform. State sovereignty became relevant and relative rather than absolute, as it was before. And it was becoming clear and increasingly clear that state sovereignty in the new conditions depends on the abilities of states to fulfill certain functions. This was a completely new thing for the realist thinking, and they couldn't simply reconcile with it, and they couldn't explain it. And finally, there was another prominent consequence of globalization that realism had troubles to explain: the rise of non-state actors, such as transnational corporations, international civil organizations, international NGOs, international terrorist organizations, media, and so on and so forth. They have been becoming increasingly powerful in international relations. It was becoming increasingly clear that effective provision of global public goods, effective global governance, effective management of the new transnational threats and challenges cannot be conducted without their participation. States themselves started to pool sovereignty, to share sovereignty to the bottom and to the up, to the bottom to the non-state organizations and upwards to the international organizations. And thus, non-state actors appeared as very important participants of the international system. International system ceased to be state-centric. Again, it was a very profound challenge to the conventional realist course, a realist theory of international relations. Finally, just to summarize it, transnational challenges and threats as a concept is very difficult for realists to reconcile with. Cooperation among states in order to resist, in order to struggle, in order to manage these transnational challenges is something that realism simply could not understand and could not analyze. This is why it was widely assumed in the era of globalization, especially in 1990s, immediately after the end of the Cold War, that classical traditional realism and structural neorealism ceased to be relevant, that their era is closed, and the new era of international relations has started, the era in which the classical rules and patterns of realism will be irrelevant, will not work. The new era will be based on global interdependence and globalization, on integration and on cooperation, on zero plus rather than zero-sum relations among states, global management of the global commons and provision of global public goods, management of the consequences of globalization, and so on and so forth. And in conditions of all these profound changes, in conditions of this new era, declared era emerging, realism really seemed outdated. Despite the difficulties of realist explanations of the profound changes in the world in 1980s and 1990s, and despite the widespread opinion that liberalism is much better equipped in terms of explaining the new phase of international relations after the end of the Cold War and in conditions of globalization, it would be mistaken, though, to assume that realism is now outdated. Because if you think that realism is outdated and the realist laws and patterns of international behavior no longer work, you will ignore very important things and objective things and phenomena that continue to exist in the international system. Such as that sovereign states remain the key actors of international politics. Yes, new actors of international relations have re-emerged, and we have an abundance and growth and rise of non-state actors. But they still do not and cannot and will not substitute for states. There is no alternative for sovereign state as the form of organization of political space. And this is very, very evident nowadays with the rise of the so-called Islamic State, with the rise of international terrorist organizations and so on. It is clear that the only alternatives to sovereign state is chaos. And sovereign states must be preserved and strengthened. Secondly, if you think that realism is outdated, you will ignore that fundamental laws of interstate interaction, of interstate relations, are the same despite the change of the social reality. And these fundamental laws of interstate relations are still as they were centuries ago. A mixture of cooperation and conflict in relations between states. Yes, cooperation have become more important and often, but conflicts have not disappeared at all in the interstate relations. Moreover, conflicts are becoming more and more increasingly evident and widespread nowadays. And even in the immediate post-Cold War period, conflicts continued to exist. Look at the Middle East. Look at the situation in Asia Pacific. Even in Europe, for instance, there was a profound conflict between Russia and the West over NATO enlargement. So conflicts coexisted with cooperation, and this is the objective reality that must not be ignored. National security was remaining as the basic need of any state. Yes, prosperity was, or economic development was also important. But considerations of national security remained vital for every single state in the world in the post-Cold War era, including and especially for the United States as the sole superpower. And finally, military power still matter in world politics and continued to matter in world politics in the post-Cold War world. Yes, the role of economics relative to the military power increased, but it does not mean that military power became irrelevant. Come on, military power was the method, was the instrument of the United States to conduct hegemonic policies in the 1990s and 2000s. And military power was the way for some countries as North Korea and Iran to resist American interventions. China having risen, and as China continues to rise economically, it transforms its economic wealth into military power. And China has already become the second power in the world after the United States in terms of defense spending. So the conclusion that we should make from this observation is the following. That the world basically after the end of the Cold War and in conditions of globalization became bifurcated. We live in parallel realities. One reality is the reality of global governance and globalization with its own logic of conduct, of cooperation, of management of transnational threats and challenges, and this is really better explained through liberalism. But the other parallel reality, which also objectively exists, and which is becoming increasingly important and which never disappeared, is the realist reality of power politics and realist interstate relations, of state interests, of security considerations, considerations of survival, the importance of military power, the role of nation states as still the key actors of international security, and so on and so forth. So it is wrong to assume that realist paradigm is outdated. It is more correct to say that realist paradigm and liberal paradigm, they explain different realities at the same time, and both these different realities are real and objective in the bifurcated world of today. Moreover, the further we go from the end of the Cold War, the more important realism becomes. With the current developments in 2000s and especially in 2010s, realism is increasingly relevant again in explaining of what's going on in the world and in providing analysis and explanation and prediction for the cause of relations among states and for the trajectory of the international system evolution. The profound and fundamental reason for that was the return of multipolarity. The unipolar moment, which emerged after the end of the Cold War, really happened to be a moment. It lasted for 15 years at best. And already in the middle of last decade, when the United States started to have troubles in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States entered a period of relative decline. And other countries, especially Russia and China, started their re-emergence as great powers in the international system. And of course, after 2014, there is no question about multipolarity in the world, because in 2014, the United States was openly challenged by another great power, which is Russia. And in 2014, the United States failed to prevent a behavior of other great power, which it considers dangerous, destabilizing, and wrong. So we have the rise of China, and China conducts very realist behavior in both regional and global terms. China strives for regional hegemony in East Asia and tries to get even more influence globally, especially in economic terms. So this is a realist logic, not a liberal logic. Russia also conducts a realist logic in its foreign policy. Now, Russia strives for regional control in Eurasia and expands its influence in the Middle East and other regions. This is also a very realist, not a liberal behavior. Above all, we have now a return of great power rivalry at the global scale. And the manifestations of this great power rivalry is the new US-Russian confrontation, which became outright in 2014 with the Ukraine crisis, and the growing competition and rivalry, strategic rivalry between the United States and China. The return of great power rivalry brings realism back, because the logic of relations among these great powers, the logic of relations between in the triangle of the United States, Russia, and China is realist, not liberal. Another manifestation and reason for the return of realism is that end of history happened to be the illusion. The end of history proclaimed by Francis Fukuyama in 1990 assumed that Western democracy has become universal and uncontested. This became false because the Western model of development and ideology is increasingly rejected in many parts of the world, not just in the Middle East, but also by China, by Russia, by some other countries in the world, and new alternatives to the Western ideology start to happen, such as authoritarian capitalism. So ideological competition returned, which also make the world much more realist than liberal. And finally, realism becomes increasingly important, and I would say even dominant, in explaining and predicting the international relations of today and of the near-term future, because key regions of the world start to develop and have already started to develop according to the realist logic. Look at the situation in Asia Pacific. There is a very competitive environment and very competitive relations between China, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. And despite the fact that both Japan and South Korea are American allies, they have very troublesome relations among themselves. And the pattern of relations in East Asia is zero-sum, not zero-plus. In Europe, we have a return of a geopolitical great power competition between Russia and NATO. In the Middle East, we have extremely troubled environment with first, on the one hand, collapse of many Arab countries, and on the other hand, a geopolitical competition between the major regional great powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia. So Asia, Europe, and Middle East already develop much more according to realist logic than the liberal logic. Thus, realism is once again relevant, and it will be detrimental for explaining of the international relations in the 21st century. There are two major trajectories of the development of realism after the end of the Cold War, and the two major ways of its adaptation to the profound changes that occurred in the international system in 1980s and 1990s. The major dimensions of classical realism, of the pre-post-Cold War realism, to put it that way, were classical political realism and structural realism. Classical political realism of Hans Morgenthau and structural realism of Kenneth Wolff. And both these dimensions gained new development after the end of the Cold War. The classical political realism, the realism of Edward Carr and Hans Morgenthau, was updated and became a neoclassical realist theory. And there was also the emergence of new concrete concepts, more specific concepts of realism, which were based on the structural realist theory of Kenneth Wolff. Let's start with the neoclassical realism, which was a certain return or revision of the classical realist, political realist writings of Hans Morgenthau and Edward Carr. The founding father of neoclassical realism is a prominent American scholar, former editor of Foreign Affairs Journal, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and former Clinton administration official, Gideon Rose. In 1998, Gideon Rose published an article called Neoclassical Realism and Theories of International Policy, which became the foundation of neoclassical realist approach. And the major point of Gideon Rose's concept is that domestic politics and conditions of states must be taken into account while analyzing drivers of their behavior. not just national interests or systemic factors. And this is a completely new development in conditions to the previous realist concepts. Because before, both Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz argued that domestic politics simply doesn't matter. That it doesn't matter what is the nature of political regime. It doesn't matter what is the system of decision-making over foreign policy. It doesn't matter who really occupies the presidential chair or who is the head of state, what are his aides, and what is the decision-making process inside the countries. It simply doesn't matter. Well, because classical realism and neorealism claimed that these domestic issues didn't matter, Gideon Rose claims it is this ignorance of domestic politics which resulted in the analytical inability of realism to explain the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was driven by domestic issues, not systemic issues. And the introduction of domestic politics, domestic issues into the foreign policy analysis allow to explain irrational behavior, such as the irrational behavior from the realist perspective of Mikhail Gorbachev in late 1980s. Similar argument was made by another prominent American scholar and journalist and another co-founder of neorealism, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria published two works related to neoclassical realism, From Wealth to Power, The Unusual Origins of American World Role, and Realism and Domestic Politics, where basically Fareed Zakaria, as Gideon Rose, combined domestic politics and realism and claimed that domestic politics must not be ignored. So what is general and what is usual for neoclassical realism for both Zakaria and Gideon Rose is that they both combined classical realism and neorealism. They were talking about the importance of national interests, domestic drivers of national interests, and systemic factors. They both added domestic factors and irrationality into the behavior of states. They both claim that we need to explain foreign policy decisions, and these theories allow us to explain foreign policy decisions which seem irrelevant from the classical realist perspective. They both explain false predictions of structural realism, inability to explain the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union. And the neoclassical realism also argues that perceptions matter. Perceptions of one's place in the system is the important variable, perhaps even more important variable than the actual place of this or that actor in the international system. So they involve even a constructivist element into the realist thinking. And let's combine how classical realism and neoclassical realism explain the behavior of states. Classical realism, Hans Morgenthau's realism, claims that states behave just like billiard balls, that they are driven by external shocks only, and their national interests are predetermined by geography, participation in alliances, capabilities, and so on and so forth. Thus, inner conditions of states could be ignored from the perspective of classical realism, and all states behave in similar way, in similar consequences. States have permanent national interests predetermined by their geography, economy, and power. States face external impulses, external shocks from the global environment and react to these external shocks rationally. And this rationality of classical realism is exactly the reason why it failed, for instance, to explain the policies of Mikhail Gorbachev in late Soviet time. And this is how neoclassical realism explains foreign policy behavior. It assumes that domestic factors such as the nature of political regime, the nature of political system, decision-making process, values, culture of this country, narratives of this country, they all matter and influence state behavior. So we have not just global strategic environment. and not just the geography of the country and the objective national interests, but we also have domestic factors that transcend these objective factors and basically result into the actual policies that states pursue. And while external threats are still considered as key drivers of foreign policy, inner structure, domestic factors, is also a very, very important variable. So neoclassical realism really managed to explain why both classical and neorealism failed to explain the 1980s and 1990s. But despite these successful attempts to overcome the weaknesses of the old realisms, neoclassical realist theory has not become an independent grand strategy. It still cannot be put at the level of Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz. Indeed, neoclassical realism is more perceived as a theory of foreign policy rather than theory of IR. They explain why states behave in a certain way in certain situations, not how international system evolves in general. And the major weaknesses of neoclassical theory are the following. By including domestic factors into their analysis, by including even some constructivist and liberal elements, this neoclassical realism reduces and destroys the analytical purity which was present in the classical realism. And secondly, neoclassical realism is unable to explain international processes at systemic level. Here it just follows the structural realism. There is no fundamental difference between structural realism and neoclassical realism in terms of explanation of what's going on in the world in general. As a result, neoclassical theory is able to give a better explanation to the behavior of state, which means to foreign policy, but it is unable to predict and explain the origins of war and peace. So the conclusion that we can make is the following. Neoclassical realism puts the focus of analysis back from the global system to the behavior of states. But the behavior of states was explained in a slightly different way than the classical realism of Hans Morgenthau, which also was talking about the behavior of states. And the major difference was introduction of domestic issues, domestic politics, and thus irrationality. Now let's talk about what happened to structural realism, how structural realism developed in the 21st century after the end of the Cold War. And the main thing is the following. Despite structural realism could not explain the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union itself, and it has enormous troubles in explaining short-term developments in the international system back at that time, especially in the 1990s, structural realism turned out to be much more correct and accurate in explaining longer-term trends, longer-term structural trajectories. And the further we go from the end of the Cold War and to the 21st century, the clearer it becomes that strategically the predictions and assumptions of structural realism about the post-Cold War period were correct. Indeed, let's remember, Kenneth Waltz and other structural realists warned against the post-Cold War instability. They claimed that the post-Cold War international system will be unstable. Well, there was a period of unipolar stability of early 1990s, but this unipolar moment was tremendously short. The new great powers quickly emerged, very quickly emerged, and 10-15 years after the end of the Cold War, and 10-15 years historically this is just nothing, it is a blink of an eye. So after that very extremely short period, great power balancing and great power competition once again became the norm and reality of the international system. It reemerged already in the end of 2000s and especially became outright after 2014, the escalation of Ukraine crisis and the emergence of the new US-Russian confrontation. So the current confrontation between Russia and the United States, the growing and deepening rivalry between the United States and China, the rivalry between China and India, international relations in Asia where mistrust and zero-sum logic prevails, international relations in the Middle East where it's simply a war of all against all, they all these factors prove that the post-Cold War period is indeed becoming really unstable. There is the pervasive growth of instability globally and regionally throughout all over the world. Another prediction of structural realists was about instability in Europe and a threat of the new great power war in Europe after the collapse of the Cold War and bipolarity. Well, for some time, great power war in Europe seemed unthinkable. Indeed, there was no return of historic rivalry between Germany and France, France and Britain, Britain and Germany. However, now we do really observe and witness the growth of confrontation between Russia and the West. And from the Russia-West perspective, a big war seems not that unthinkable nowadays. Look, Russia and the United States were at the brink of direct military clash 3 times after 1991. The first one was in Kosovo in 1999 when Russia occupied the Pristina airport and NATO Supreme Commander Wesley Clark gave an order to kick the Russians out. The second time was in the Russian-Georgian War, the Georgian conflict of 2008, when the George Bush Jr. administration in the United States contemplated about the use of force, the use of American force against the Russian troops in Georgia. And the third is, of course, Ukraine crisis of today. So even in the post-Cold War period, the intensity of Russia-US rivalry and contradictions was so high that we were at the brink, 3 times we were at the brink of the war, of direct use of force. And what kind of environment do we have today? We have US-Russian confrontation, which is for a good long while, unfortunately. We have militarization of Europe. NATO expands its military presence in Poland and the Baltic states. Russia expands its military presence in the western part of Russia. We have a continuous collapse, devastation and collapse of arms control, including Europe. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the so-called CFE Treaty, is nowadays dead. We have the emergence of new theaters of war and new ways to inflict damage towards each other, such as the cyber field. So all this combined, again, some experts claim that we are structurally in a pre-war situation among the East and the West in the Russia-West relations. So thus, from the current perspective, the predictions of Kenneth Waltz, Christopher Lane and other structural realists about the potential war in Europe after the collapse of the Cold War were right. But these predictions were correct from the longer term perspective, not from the short term perspective. And finally, structural realists warned against anti-hegemonic balancing and claimed that emergence of the United States as the sole superpower would cause consolidation of other powers against the hegemon. This was the argument made by Kenneth Waltz and other structural realists in late 80s, early 90s. Yes, that it did not happen immediately in early 1990s, but attempts to start balancing against the United States did take place already in 1990s. Let's remember the so-called Primakov's triangle. Yevgeny Primakov became Russian foreign minister in 1996, and he immediately offered the idea of the triangle creation of Russia, China, India as three non-Western great powers coalition to counterbalance the United States. And since the middle of 1990s, the logic of Russian foreign policy was indeed counterbalance the United States together with the other non-Western great powers. Yes, this counterbalancing was not successful, but in terms of Russian policies, it still existed. And later, in conditions of the power shift, in conditions of the rise of China, rise of Russia, non-Western centers of power becoming increasingly powerful, this great power competition and counterbalancing towards the United States became outright open and vigorous. And today, in realities of after 2014, after Ukraine crisis, there are no doubts that Russia and China conduct the policy of counterbalancing the United States. So what Kenneth Waltz and others predicted back then, in early 1990s, became really the reality of 2014 and afterwards. Moreover, you can counterbalance the United States not just in the open and vigorous and outright way as Russia and China do, but also in a soft way, in a different way. And the scholars like Robert Pape and T.V. Paul already back in 1990s argued that counterbalancing does not necessarily involve direct political conflict. On the contrary, counterbalancing against the hegemon could be conducted in a soft and almost invisible way by limiting hegemonic influence with norms, with institutions, and other non-confrontational instruments. And according to Pape and T.V. Paul, this was the policies of even American allies and partners. So the United States is counterbalanced by the non-Western great powers, Russia and China, directly, and by the Western powers indirectly through soft balancing. Thus, you see these structural realist predictions indeed turned out to be right. Within the general structural realist paradigm, several concrete theories of structural realism emerged after the end of the Cold War. The major ones were offensive realism of John Mearsheimer and defensive realism of Robert Jervis. Offensive realism of John Mearsheimer provide the following assumptions about the state of the world. It claims that security is scarce, that offense and defense cannot be distinguished. They are two sides of the same coin. That technology and geography favor offense rather than defense, and that anarchy promotes aggressive behavior. Thus, the major proposition of offensive realism is that every single country in the world tries to be hegemon. So every country conducts revisionist behavior, and thus offensive realism explains expansionism, wars, and strive for hegemony of all. Defensive realism explains the world in a different way and has different reading of the global environment that we face. According to Robert Jervis and defensive realism, which is much closer to the classical structural realism of Kenneth Waltz, security is plentiful, offensive and defense are distinguishable and very different policies. Technology and geography favor defense rather than offense. And anarchy, according to them, promotes status quo behavior. So the major point of defensive realism is that countries, including great powers, want to keep status quo and prevent hegemony. Right? So the major contradiction is Mearsheimer claims that everyone strives for hegemony, whereas defensive realism claims that every country fight against those who try to be the hegemon. They explain over expansionism, they explain cooperation, and the main purpose of great power behavior, according to Jervis, is to keep status quo rather than conduct offensive and revisionist foreign policy. Another structural theory emerged after the end of the Cold War was the balance of threat theory by a prominent American scholar, Stephen Walt. According to Stephen Walt, if one great power rises to the potential hegemony and predominance, its military posture and overall behavior endangers threat perceptions of the others. And this explains the emergence of alliances, the development of military build-up, and militarized rivalries. And the other opposite theories of within the whole paradigm of structural realism are soft balancing theory of Robert Pope and unipolar stability of William Wolford. They both start from the same proposition, that there is a one great power which is too strong to be balanced. And they both agree with the unipolarity of the system that emerged after the end of the Cold War. But the conclusions that they make from this proposition are opposite. According to Pope, the other countries will balance the hegemon, but do it softly. And this theory thus explains the subtle constraint actions towards the hegemon. Whereas Wolford claims that in conditions of unipolarity, balancing is impossible, and the only option for the other countries is bandwagon, which means to join the hegemon. Now let's make a closer look to the offensive realism as one of the most important theories within the structural realist paradigm. The founding father of offensive realism is one of the most prominent realist scholars of today, Chicago University professor John Mearsheimer, and his major book in which he developed this theory is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And the tragedy of great power politics, according to Mearsheimer, is that every great power wants to become a hegemon. And there is a competition for hegemony, not against hegemony. Mearsheimer criticizes Kenneth Waltz and Stephen Walt, the defensive realism proponents, and Kenneth Waltz, well, the neorealism, which is also defensive realism. He criticizes them for seeing the world solely through the eyes of satisfied status quo powers. And Mearsheimer makes a very relevant case that some states, they are not satisfied. They want to change their status in the system. They want to advance their relative power positions. And this is, according to Mearsheimer, is applicable to all great powers. All great powers are power maximizers. They want to increase their scope of power without limits, and they all fight for, not against, hegemony. According to Kenneth Waltz, according to Stephen Walt, according to neorealism and defensive realism, balance is fight against hegemony. And the international system struggles against the aspiring hegemon and prevents the hegemon from emergence. Mearsheimer makes the opposite conclusion. He claims that balancing is in fact this fight for hegemony, not against hegemony. He claims that states do not know when their power is sufficient. There cannot be a satisfied states at all, according to Mearsheimer. States are driven to accumulate as much power and capabilities as possible, and this leads them to pursue aggressive expansionist policies. And the objective of every single state is to become either a regional or a global hegemon. And now let's conclude with a more detailed talk about another very important theory within the structural school of thought, the balance of threat theory developed by Stephen Walt, a prominent international affairs scholar and professor at Harvard University. And in his book, Origins of Alliances, published in 1987, Stephen Walt modified the balance of power theory. He claimed that behavior of states and its will to form alliances depends not just on the balance of material power, but on perception of threat. So perception is much more important or no less important than reality. And this is really relevant in the history of international relations. Why, for instance, French and Indian nuclear weapons have never drove the United States to conduct confrontational policies towards these countries? The US was never threatened by French nuclear weapon or by Indian nuclear weapon. But in the case with North Korea and potentially Iran, we have a completely different situation. And the United States do its best to prevent Iranian nuclear weapon and is now dealing with the non-Korean nuclear weapon, which is a complete threat and unacceptable thing for the United States. How to explain it? Just with perceptions. That the United States perceives, due to objective reasons, but it perceives French nuclear weapons as non-threatening and North Korean nuclear weapons as threatening. So this balance of threat perceptions is the major trigger of the creation of alliances. Russia perceives the enlargement of NATO as a threat. And NATO alliance did perceive the existence of the Soviet Union as the threat in the early phases of the Cold War, and these perceptions are the major drivers of the behavior of states in terms of combinations and the making of alliances. So we've touched upon the major dimensions of the realist thinking development after the end of the Cold War. We explained why it seemed irrelevant in the 1990s, in the early stages of the post-Cold War period. We explained and discussed how it became once again relevant later on, especially after 2014 and basically starting with the middle of 2000s. We've discussed the major trajectories, the major theories evolution, such as neoclassical realism and the new dimensions of structural realism after the end of the Cold War. And if you want to study more, here is the additional reading. Hello. Today we will talk about Russian foreign policy, its realist logic and philosophy. And the purpose of this lecture will be to try to prove you why Russia is a realist power. And I will do this in the following way. I will start by describing predominant Western assumptions about Russian foreign policy and claim that they are wrong. In order to prove why they are wrong, I will go and illustrate the logic and philosophy of Russian foreign policy. And I'll prove that their continuity with the evolution of Russia-West relations, including the most known cases of Ukraine and Syria. Then I will pass over to describing the Russian perception of external environment, especially power distribution in the world. And in this description, I will identify both positive and negative factors, both the opportunities that Russia sees for itself in the international system and risks that Russia faces. And finally, I will conclude with describing the major Russian foreign policy priorities and the future of Russia's relations with the United States, NATO, and the European Union, the major Western actors. So what are the usual Western assumptions on Russian foreign policy? First and foremost, Russia is claimed to be unpredictable. Unpredictability is the basis of the Western paradigm of analyzing Russia. Indeed, the narrative is, who could anticipate that Russia would go and take Crimea? Who could think about Russia's ability to use force against Ukraine, or Russia's readiness to use force in Ukraine, support the rebels in Donbass, or who could predict Russia's desire to go and join the war in Syria? After all, throughout the recent years, Russia has been consistently claiming that it is ready to use force in the post-Soviet space only. Secondly, Russian foreign policy is claimed to be revisionist. In its foreign policy, Russia revises, violates the established rules of the game. And third, that in doing so, Russia challenges the international order. The major American assumption and paradigm on Russia is that Russia challenges the international order that has been established since 1945 and strengthened after 1991. Russian foreign policy is also claimed in the West to be not in touch with the reality, that Russia ignores many things like globalization, economic interdependence, and that Russia pursues an outdated 19th century type of foreign policy based on power logic only and ignoring other realities of the international environment. And finally, Russian foreign policy is claimed to be driven by domestic politics and depending on who is the president. And the narrative is that in the 1990s, under Boris Yeltsin, Russia was pursuing a pro-Western foreign policy, Then, under Vladimir Putin, Russia was turned by him into the other direction. Then, under Medvedev, again, Russia attempted to turn towards the West. And when Putin returned to the Russian presidency, he again drove Russia back into the 19th century type of foreign policy. And as a result, Russian foreign policy is claimed to be unsuccessful, self-isolating, and accelerating Russia's overall decline. But these assumptions, in my full conviction, are wrong. Why are they wrong? Because they are based on a fundamentally false paradigm, on a paradigm which simply is unable to see the logic of Russian foreign policy, which is fundamentally different from the Russian paradigm. In order to understand the Russian foreign policy, you have to look upon this through the Russian eyes. You have to use the right paradigm, the right system of coordinates. And indeed, the systems of coordinates between Russia and the West have been different after the end of the Cold War. Russian and Western views on international order and on the places and roles that Russia and the West play in this international order are fundamentally different. The Western assumptions about international order and Western and Russian roles in the international order are based on the notion of the US victory in the Cold War, that US leadership should be the main pillar of the post-Cold War order, and universal US-led liberal international order, which Russia should eventually join. But Russia sees itself and the post-Cold War order and its place in this post-Cold War order fundamentally differently. And how exactly Russia sees all this, we will talk in the remaining parts of this lecture. So let's talk about the realist basis of Russian foreign policy. Russian foreign policy in general, and at every single time, is shaped by three major factors. One of them could be described as independent variable, and it is more or less constant, while the other two are depending variables, and they predetermine tactical shifts and priorities of Russian foreign policy, such as whether it is trying to establish partnership with the West or allows confrontation with the West and proclaims the so-called pivot to the East or bigger Eurasia as major Russian foreign policy priorities. Whether it projects power to Syria or limits itself with the post-Soviet space. Whether it reacts to Ukraine's movement into the West by using gas instrument or by incorporating Crimea and interfering into the civil war in Donbass. This is the dependent variables. So the independent variable of Russian foreign policy is Russia's foreign policy philosophy or strategic purpose, which are largely a product of its identity, history, and to much less extent a product of its domestic politics. So this independent variable again explains continuity of Russian foreign policy. The dependent variables, which explain change in Russian foreign policy, are the following two. First, it is Russia's perception of the external environment, which includes the state of the international system and its evolution, distribution of power, trends and rules of great power relations, and Russia's perceptions of threats and opportunities into the world around Russia. And the second dependent variable is dynamic of Russia's economic and military development. So the correlation of these three factors, again among which one is independent and two others are dependent, so the correlation of these three provide a sound explanation and prediction of Russian foreign policy. Russian foreign policy logic and philosophy, the independent variable, can be described by two words, two simple words: great power. And this is indeed a point of departure for understanding Russian foreign policy, and this is very, very realist. Only realists, not liberals, see the world through the prism of great powers. Ever since the end of the Cold War, Russia has perceived itself as the independent great power and independent pole of the multipolar world, a part of a sort of global oligarchy a global concert of nations which must have a permanent seat at the global decision-making table, and also which must have a region of its own. So Russia perceived itself as a sort of regional hegemon with global decision-making. This perception is a product of Russian history. Russia has been a great power and a part of the European Grand Politique since early 18th century, and perceived itself as independent Poland power since at least the 16th century, the reign of Ivan IV. This perception is also a product of Russian identity, which is still, to a certain extent, imperial great power identity and self-perception of itself as one of the major poles and centers of gravity in the world, again, since the 16th or even 15th century. And I would cite here the idea of Russia as the Third Rome, Russia as the descendant of Roman and Byzantine empires, and so on and so forth. It is very funny that in this aspect, but only in this aspect, Russian identity is quite similar to the American one. Both Russia and the United States cannot join anyone else's geopolitical projects and prefer to stay isolated rather than accept someone else's superiority. Russia can be either equal to other great powers or a leader vis-à-vis less great powers. Finally, this philosophy is a product of the Cold War. Russia was a superpower of the Cold War, and this philosophy is the product of how Russia perceived the end of the Cold War, which, unlike many in the West assumed, did not change Russian great power identity. The end of the Cold War for Russia was not a rejection of Russia's great power identity or its previous history. Unlike Germany in 1945, Russia in 1992 perceived itself as the same great power and imperial Russia, but just without communism. Indeed, the Russian perception of the end of the Cold War was that the Cold War was ended in 1989 through joint deliberate efforts, cooperation of two superpowers, and that after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and even after collapse of the USSR, Russia still should be treated and respected as a great power. The paradigm of Russian foreign policy in late 1980s, early 1990s was that yes, the USSR contributed to the unification of Germany, allowed dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the Velvet revolutions in Central and Eastern European countries. It withdrew its troops from Central and Eastern Europe and so on and so forth in order to obtain a leading seat at the decision-making table, a position of the country number 2 after the United States or together with the United States. Something, like the second consul of the ancient Roman Republic, the first consul being the United States of America. What does this great power logic and philosophy mean in practice for Russian foreign policy? First, it means that Russia is fully sovereign in terms of its domestic, foreign and defense policies. Actually, Russia indeed considers itself one of the few fully sovereign countries in the world. Those countries that can enjoy full independence and say no to the United States when necessary. So Russia conducts independent foreign policy, formulates its national interests itself, it conducts an independent domestic politics. No one must try to teach Russia what its foreign policy interests or its domestic politics should be. Other great powers, including the United States and the European Union, according to this logic, should engage Russia as it is, rather than as they would like Russia to be. Finally, according to this logic, Russia should be self-reliant in its defense policy. It should not outsource or share its defense with the others. And military alliances in which Russia participates can be Russia-centric and Russia-led only. Remarkable, there is no official talk about, let's say, a Russian-Chinese alliance. Partnership between Russia and China, yes, of course, but not an alliance. The only military alliance that Russia has is the Collective Security Treaty Organization at the post-Soviet space, the alliance which Russia leads. Secondly, Being a great power in a multipolar world means that Russia must have a region of its own, which constitutes the Russian pole. This is the majority of the Commonwealth of Independent States space, or the post-Soviet space. Russia considers itself as the indispensable nation at the post-Soviet space, the final broker and the center of the Russia-centric security and economic orders. And according to this philosophy, Russian interests and centrality at the post-Soviet space must be respected by the other players. Neither the West nor China must pull the members of the Eurasian Economic Union or Collective Security Treaty Organization out. Whereas economic and security orders of the common neighborhood, the countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and Azerbaijan, the countries that member neither European Union nor Eurasian Economic Union, the order for them should be elaborated jointly by Russia and the West, not imposed by the West only. And obviously, it means that the West should respect and recognize Russia-centric institutions at the post-Soviet space. China today is playing according to these rules, while the West does not. According to this logic, promoting Russia-centric integration at the post-Soviet space and preventing countries of the region joining different security and economic orbits was, is, and will be the foreign policy priority number one for Russia and the fundamental criteria for Russia's relations with the third powers and players. Again, let's compare Russia-Western and Russian-Chinese relations at the post-Soviet space. Russia is not threatened by China increasing trade and investment in Central Asian states. And it was not afraid of the EU increasing trade and investment with Ukraine. Russia was, however, challenged by the European Union, including Ukraine into its association regime. And China is doing nothing like that in Central Asia. It does not claim that the countries like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan must withdraw from the Eurasian Economic Union as a precondition for their relations with China. Third, being a great power means that Russia takes active and permanent part in global decision-making, on par with other global power centers, especially on issues of sovereignty and the use of force. If someone takes unilateral decisions in these issues and thus ignores Russia, as the United States did in Yugoslavia in 1999, in Iraq in 2003, as the US and many Western countries did with Kosovo independence in 2008, and the US, UK, France, and NATO did in Libya in 2011, they simply refuse Russia of its great power status. And this is perceived as humiliation and taken as a humiliation by Russia. So Russia's objection are not necessarily about the specific regions and the countries concerned, and thus the question like whether Libya or Serbia are so much important for Russia as specific countries are wrong. Russia's objections are about Russia. Russia as a great power, it's Russia's status and Russia's identity. And unsurprisingly, all these episodes that I mentioned resulted in severe crisis of US-Russia and Russia-NATO relations. Fourth, being a great power means that Russia should pursue principles of diplomatic equality and reciprocity with other power centers, both Western and non-Western. What does it mean? It means equality in decision-making on issues of regional and global security, equality in building European security order, equality in managing use of force in the broader Middle East, equality in decision-making over Syria and determining the fate of Syrian regime, equality in establishing the international rules and norms and institutions, and so on and so forth. And this is exactly what Russia is trying to achieve in Ukraine and Syria. Reciprocity principle means that the statement quod licet Jovi non licet bovi, which is in Latin and translated into English like what is allowed to the Jupiter is not allowed to the bull, this principle does not work with Russia. If the West violates international law and territorial integrity of states, Russia will do the same. If the West interferes into Russian domestic politics and supports politicians and NGOs that the West likes, Russia will do the same. If the US hacks Russia will also hack. If the West conducts vigorous information propaganda, Russia will also do the same, and so on. Fifth, being a great power means that Russia designs and manages international orders, regional and global, together and on par with the other poles. These regimes and orders should be jointly elaborated, not imposed by one of the sides. And again, compare Russia's relations with the West and China. Russia has been claiming that it should be a co-designer of the European security system and fighting against the expansion of the Western security order, namely NATO, since early 1990s. The latest positive initiative was Medvedev's new European Security Treaty proposal. The West remained deaf. Whereas with China, this joint elaboration and joint management of the Eurasian space is taking place. And the example is the coordinated development between the Eurasian Economic Union and One Belt, One Road Chinese project. Sixth, according to this philosophy, Russia as the independent power should not join anyone else, be it the West or China. Instead, Russia should find its own place between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Russia should have its own region, which is the post-Soviet space, which should be partly integrated with both the Atlantic and the Pacific, but stay independent from both of them. And indeed, Russia perceives itself as Euro-Pacific Eurasian power and develops the concepts of Greater Eurasia. Greater Eurasia is not about Russia's isolation from Europe or Asia. It is not a temporary substitute or compensation for the current Russia-Western confrontation. It is the strategic orientation which should be open for the others, which should help to integrate Russia with both Europe and Eurasia. And this strategic orientation is very likely to stay disregarding the conjuncture of Russia-Western or Russian-Chinese relations. Seventh, according to this philosophy, balancing and sustaining balanced relationships with other great powers remains central to Russian foreign policy. Indeed, even now when Russia-West relations are confrontational, Russia remains fully committed to balancing at both regional and transregional and global levels, and uses every opportunity to restore the balanced relationships at the global level. At the transregional level, Russia is balancing China with India and Japan. Including India and Pakistan into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was Russian initiative exactly for the sake of balancing. Witness how vigorously also Russia started intensifying relations with Japan as soon as this became possible with the arrival of the Trump administration and the United States. And witness Russian attempts to overcome confrontation with the US as soon as Russia saw the window of opportunity, and this was the Russian interpretation of the arrival of Donald Trump administration. Russian approach to Donald Trump White House was not, and even remains not, confrontational at all. And there are other elements, the balancing philosophy of Russian foreign policy in the world. Eighth, according to the same philosophy, Russia is neither inherently pro-Western nor inherently anti-Western. The state of Russia-West relations depends on whether the West accepts the terms that I outlined above or doesn't. The US-Russian relations reset under the Obama administration and Medvedev administrations happened when the Obama administration seemed to reject regime change policy, reduce the share of ideology in its foreign policy, when it started to respect Russian interests at the former USSR and regard Russia as a great power, cooperation with which was necessary for promotion of US vital national interests. And this reset failed when the United States returned to the ideologization, regime change, and ignoring Russian policy worldwide, such as intervention in Libya and the US approach towards the Arab Spring. And the relations between Russia and the United States became finally confrontational when the United States supported an anti-Russian regime change in Ukraine and started integration of Ukraine into the Western orbit despite Russian opposition. So Russia's sympathy, initial sympathy towards Trump, again was based on the Russian conviction that Trump was going to make US foreign policy less ideological, reject regime change, regard Russia as a great power, and promote American interests in their narrow understanding. And finally, ninth, this foreign policy philosophy prescribes Russia not to hesitate to use force and undermine seriously its relations with the other players if Russian vital national and foreign policy interests are at stake. And Russia did it 4 times. In 1999 in Kosovo, in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Ukraine, and finally in 2015 in Syria. And look, these components of Russian foreign policy philosophy are essentially realist. Above, in the previous parts of the lecture, we studied the strategic purpose and constant realist logic of Russian foreign policy, which is, as I said, the independent variable of Russian foreign policy. And as Russia thinks, what is the best way to implement this philosophy, this great power thinking? Russia is looking upon the dependent variables. And these are the state of the international system, above all, the structure of this international system, power distribution in the world, and Russia's place in this power structure, and the internal state of Russian economy, political system, and defense. And these components are also core realism. In practical terms, Russian foreign policy is to a certain extent a constant search for ways to sustain itself a great power. What is the best way for Russia to promote and consolidate itself as a great power in this or that environment? What kind of relations does Russia need with the United States, NATO, EU, China, and others, the relations which suit Russia's strategic purpose best in the current existing conditions? Answers to these questions depend on the structure of the international system. And this is a neo-realist or structural component of Russian foreign policy. Indeed, if the world is unipolar and the West is undisputed center of political and economic gravity, Russian foreign policy then, as a great power, and Russia as a great power, can survive just through strategic partnership with the West, through Russia's integration into the Western-centric decision-making system. And this was indeed the case in early 2000s, and especially in early 1990s, when Russia perceived the world as unipolar. However, if the world is multipolar, then it's a different case. If the West is no longer the center of gravity, logically, why should Russia conduct a Western-centric foreign policy? In this case, the quality and mood of Russia's relations with the West do no longer determine Russian ability to sustain itself as a great power, and the best way for Russia to sustain itself as the great power is outside of the Western framework. And this is exactly the case today. And the turning point happened in the middle of 2000s when the United States started to fail in Iraq and Afghanistan, when the rise of non-Western powers became evident, and Russia itself became financially independent from the West. Since then, Russia's return to Western orbit has been completely off the table. Provided the current global trends and the internal state of Russia, including its defense modernization, I see no reason why Russia would revise this approach in the observable future, either under Vladimir Putin or after him. Evolution of the Russia-West relations after the end of the Cold War is the best case to illustrate this realist logic of Russian foreign policy. In early 90s, Russia sincerely anticipated that it will determine the nature of international order together with the United States and the West at large, both regionally, in Europe above all, and globally, on the issues of state sovereignty, the use of military force, and so on. Russia wanted to be a co-designer of the post-Cold War international order and manager of that order on par with the United States, EU, China, and other global power centers. This co-management and co-designing was regarded as the rightful place for Russia in the international system. And in this context, imagine the shock, confusion, and anger in Moscow when it turned out that this agenda will never be fulfilled. That instead of building a new post-Cold War order together with Russia as the equal partner, the United States started instead to build this order without Russia, both globally and regionally. That Russia was sidelined from the decision-making table. And the major manifestation of this change was NATO enlargement. Russia indeed perceived NATO enlargement as the greatest challenge, not because it posed a military threat to Russia, but because NATO enlargement constituted Russia's expulsion from the post-Cold War order-making and decision-making on the issues of war and peace. It manifested the Western refusal to address Russia as a great power. Later, since the middle of 2000s, Russia perceives NATO enlargement to the post-Soviet countries, Ukraine and Georgia, as the major security threat. Again, not because it would make Russia more vulnerable militarily, but this as well, but mainly because it threatened to ruin the Russia-centric subsystem of the international system, the Russia-centric world, which is indispensable for Russia's great power identity. So for 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, Russia has been trying to reach a deal with the West and figure out the rules of the game, such as to limit the expansion of the Western order, to figure out the rules of the use of force in Europe and beyond Europe, mechanisms of decision-making that would guarantee that opinion of the major European power, which is Russia, is taken into account, and so on. And Russia did it in various forms. And each time the Russian opinion was ignored. And each time Russia was compelled to take provocative steps and use force as a response to this ignoring Russia policy pursued by the West. Remember the accelerated march of the Russian paratroopers from Bosnia to Pristina airport in Kosovo in 1999. Recall the Russian-Georgian War in August 2008 and subsequent Russia's recognition of independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Recall Russia's interference with Ukraine and incorporation of Crimea in 2014 into Russian Federation. And finally, Russian mission in Syria conducted since 2015. Each time the Russian actions were generally getting more tough and dangerous because the vital interests of Russia were at stake. But the roots of all of these actions are absolutely the same. Indeed, for Russia, Ukraine crisis and even incorporation of Crimea is about rules and order, about resisting the Western regime change policy, especially at the Russian neighborhood, and about the limits to the expansion of the West, not about Russian territorial expansion or rebuilding of the empire. The Western support for Euromaidan in Ukraine and the rapid institutionalization of the results of the Euromaidan were perceived in Russia as a deliberate war against Russia itself. That the United States and the EU want to pull Ukraine into their orbit, prevent any chance of Ukraine's integration with Russia in the observable future, and perhaps even a start of a series of regime changes in the former USSR, and thus the purpose was perceived to throw Russia back into 1990s, deprive Russia of many of its foreign policy achievements since late 2000s. And Russia reacted to this policy with incorporation of Crimea and support of one of the sides of the civil conflict in Ukraine, including through the unrecognized military interference into the eastern part of Ukraine. Except for Crimea, which is indeed a unique case, Russian purpose in Ukraine is not territorial conquest, is not partition or any other local nature. The purposes are indeed global and realist. First, it was vital for Moscow to destroy the precedent of the US supporting and encouraging a forceful regime change in a country which Russia considers most vital, territorially, culturally, historically closest to Russia. a regime change in a country which Russia considers the same people with Russians. Russia is generally against regime change policy, but in Ukraine it is simply beyond the limits of good and bad. Secondly, Russia tries to crash the political and international status quo that emerged in Ukraine after the Euromaidan won, and Russia wants to confirm a rule according to which a political regime in Ukraine and international positioning of Ukraine can be sustainable and peaceful only with the Russian consent, and if they are created jointly with Russia and managed together with Russia. Originally, Russia tried to do it through the counter-revolution. Now Russia is trying to do this through the implementation of the Minsk agreements, especially the political obligations that Ukraine should fulfill in accordance to the Minsk agreements, constitutional reform, decentralization, special status for Donbass, and so on. These are, for Russia, the change of political status quo in Ukraine. So Ukraine was the first battlefield for rules and recognition of Russia's status and role as great power, as co-designer and co-manager of the international order. However, achieving this is extremely difficult, and today there is little prospect that resolution in Ukraine will happen in the observable future. Instead, there is a stalemate. Thus, in late 2015, Russia decided to establish the second battlefield for rules and for Russia's great power status promotion. And the second battlefield became Syria. Russian game in Syria was and is much more global than regional or local. It was again much more about Russia as a great power and international order than some local interests that Russia had or has in this country. The rationale behind Russia's joining the war in Syria was threefold. First, preventing forceful regime change, and Russia came exactly when the fall of the Assad regime in Syria seemed very likely. Secondly, promoting Russia as a great power capable of projecting power and creating realities on the ground, the new geopolitical realities, no matter what the West and the United States think of it. And third, preventing Syria from turning into a black hole, a safe haven for terrorists such as Libya today, presenting statehood, preserving statehood and secular regime in Syria. And look, as for 2017, we can say that Russia succeeded. Thus, we can make the following conclusion on Russian foreign policy. That we can make a conclusion that Russian foreign policy is predictable. Ukraine and crisis, Crimea, are natural and quite predictable results of the fundamental and systemic disagreement between Russia and the West on the international order and Russia's place in it. They are results, not causes of the problems. Secondly, we can make a conclusion that Russian foreign policy is defensive, not revisionist or expansionist. Russia is not trying to question the Western order as such. Russia is not trying to roll NATO back to the status quo of 1989. Instead, it is fighting further expansion of the Western order, be it NATO or association with the EU. And Ukraine and Crimea are defensive steps for Russia, not offensive steps. They are the ways to limit the Western expansion. In Syria, Russia also struggles against the Western revisionist policy, preventing regime change, which is the apex, of course, of revisionism. So from this, we clearly see that Russian foreign policy is driven by realist and even neo-realist, defensive realist logic. And thirdly, Russian foreign policy is driven by systemic factors, not by who is president today or by the purpose of, let's say, strengthening Vladimir Putin's domestic regime. Russia-Western disagreement on the post-Cold War order and Russia's place in this order existed well before Putin came to power, and they have little to do with the Russian domestic regime. Again, remember the accelerated march of the Russian paratroopers in Kosovo in 1999, or the Russia's vigorous struggle against NATO enlargement in 1990s. It happened during Yeltsin period, not Putin period. So Russian foreign policy is driven by systemic factors, which prove that Russian foreign policy is essentially realist. Having discussed the independent variable of Russian foreign policy, its realist, great power, logic, and philosophy, let's now move to the dependent variables of Russian foreign policy and discuss Russia's perception of the world, Russia's perception of the structure of the international system and global environment in general. And this picture, which exists in the Russian mind, is very mixed. And it is making Russia self-confident and concerned at the same time. I will start with what Russia regards as positive features and opportunities. First, according to Russia, the world has become truly multipolar. This is beyond discussion. Secondly, center of economic and political gravity has moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the West is no longer the undisputed center of modernity. Third, regionalism is taking lead over globalism and especially universalism. Fourth, the end of history, which is universality of Western values and liberal democratic development model, finally proved to be an illusion. The order that the West tried to establish and universalize not just faced resistance from the outside, but started to crumble from within. Witness Donald Trump election, the US gradual depart from the foreign policy consensus of the last several decades, or Brexit from the European Union, or the general rise of right-wing and left-wing populists in European societies and political systems. The United States started a long, controversial, and extremely difficult, but fundamentally unstoppable adaptation to the world, which started to develop contrary to the basic American ideological assumptions and started to develop in accordance to what Russia has been talking about since 1990s. This is Donald Trump and his role in the American foreign policy as viewed from Russia. According to Russia, Trump was elected to a certain extent because the foreign policy consensus promoted by majority of the American traditional foreign policy elite no longer works. Then, according to Russia, the Trump administration reduced the role of ideology in the US foreign policy, less emphasis on democracy and human rights, rejects regime change policy, and promotes a more national-centric, narrow understanding of American national interests. Thus, Russia does not perceive the Trump administration, unlike the previous US administration, as systemically anti-Russian or an existential threat. The European Union is also thinking about a more pragmatic foreign policy, including towards the East, towards Russia. NATO, under the pressure from the Donald Trump administration, is again regarding counterterrorism as a more important priority and challenge than Russia. Russia successfully ended enlargement of the Western order, both NATO enlargement and enlargement of the integrationist orbit of the European Union. Both adapt their policies towards the East. Yes, it was costly for Russia, but the price, which is no further enlargement of the West, is worth paying. China, according to Russia, is not a threat for the time being, but an extremely valuable asset. It is a manifestation of multipolarity. It is a partner in building the greater Eurasia, which is perceived a place for Russia in the global system for the time being. Asia Pacific, including China, but not only China, is the opportunity to develop what could become the Russian El Dorado, the Siberia and the Far East. Russia must use the potential of the region to boost its last underdeveloped frontier of the Pacific. So these are generally positive part of the picture of the world that Russia sees today. As I said before, Russia sees not just opportunities but also threats and challenges in the world today. And these negative components of the Russian perception of the world is also a very profound determinant of Russian foreign policy. So what do these negative components consist of? They consist of the following. The current domestic turmoil in the United States prevent any change of US foreign policy towards Russia in a constructive way and impede US-Russian cooperation where it could really contribute to the interests of the sides. Under Trump, the United States is not systemically anti-Russian, but very unpredictable. Moreover, it clearly prefers unilateralism, disregards international law, and has much less restraints on the use of force than under Obama. The United States under Donald Trump approaches the others from the position of strength and is physically unable to roll back and make concessions. Trump must look strong and as a winner. He can't allow look weak. And this is a very dangerous situation in the US-Russian relations. Then, the US traditional establishment and elite is unwilling to reconcile with the new reality, with the necessity to adapt, and is preparing for a post-Trump revenge. Russian attitudes towards them is best expressed by a famous characterization of Bourbons after the Restoration in France in 1815. They have learned nothing and forgotten nothing. The new ideological backlash in the United States is very likely after Trump, and this ideological backlash will aggravate, of course, US-Russian confrontation even more. The United States will return to the policy of regime change in general and towards Russia in particular, increase support of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And many Russian experts are seriously warned in 2016 that if Hillary Clinton had won, the US-Russian direct military clash might become quite likely. So this situation might return. New arms race and further military build-up in Europe is very probable and basically going on. NATO won't revise the Warsaw Summit decisions, and the United States won't refuse to deploy missile defenses in Poland and Romania. Russia will retaliate with its own military deployment, and here we go. We face the prospect of the new arms race in Europe. Next, there is a collapse of remaining nuclear arms control. It is not excluded that the INF, the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty, is under question. The New START Treaty might fall as well, especially if the United States accelerates strategic missile defense policy. The European Union is unable to reject its previous paradigm, according to which the EU is and should be the only pole of integration in wider Europe, and all the other European countries, including Russia, should be kind of concentric circles around the EU. The EU is unable to recognize Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union as the second pole of integration in wider Europe. Middle East is just in the beginning of profound destabilization, and the problems there will not end with the destruction of the Islamic State. Russia is declining. Economically, it is not booming and stagnating. Its technological backwardness is increasing, and demographic situation in Russia is bad. And sanctions are to stay for the next years to come for sure. And for instance, Crimea-related sanctions might stay for at least several decades. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from this description? We can say that on the one hand, there is no need for Russia to change the fundamentals of its foreign policy, such as refusal to perceive participation in the Western orbit or maintaining friendly relations with the West as necessary preconditions for its great power status. Western centricism in Russian foreign policy is indeed over. Russia will continue its strategic focus on Eurasia and continue struggling with the West for international order, recognition of its great power status, in terms of relations being more important than their mood. And terms of relations will be more important than their mood. Thus, relations with the West will remain transactional and largely confrontational and surely unfriendly. Secondly, Russia feels itself as the right side of history. There is no sense at all in Moscow that Russia is losing. Instead, there are reasons to argue that Russia is actually prevailing, at least selectively. And the successes of Russia's operation in Syria is the clear manifestation of this Russia's prevailing. Russia does not consider its foreign policy to be outdated. Instead, in the Russian perception, Russian foreign policy is actually reflecting the emerging rule and victory, and many policies of Donald Trump are the latest manifestation to it. So in the Russian perception, it is actually the EU which is the big exception in the current international system, not Russia. And the current international system is getting more and more realist. But on the other hand, we can make a conclusion that Russia needs to prepare for a long-term period of unfriendly and even adversarial relations with the West, and quite likely for a further aggravation of this confrontation, up to a direct military threat. Domestic situation in the United States prevents using the opportunity that emerged with the Donald Trump administration to overcome the US-Russian confrontation. And after Trump, whether he leaves in 2020 or before, it is likely to become much worse. Thus, Russia makes a conclusion that it needs to invest in military, in deterrence, and in relations with the rest to keep the balance, be it China, India, Iran, or some European countries. Look, these are just the paradigmical, the classical elements of a realist foreign policy philosophy and the realist conduct. Finally, let me describe the major priorities of Russian foreign policy based on its realist logic and philosophy. And I will start with global priorities and then continue with regional ones. So what are the major global priorities? First, it is sustaining strategic autonomy, which means that Russia does not depend on any others in terms of security, does not join the alliances where Russia is not the major player, aims to sustain balanced relations with the other great powers, and pursues an independent foreign policy. Russia cannot join NATO or cannot join China. Secondly, it is active participation in global decision-making on equal terms with the other centers of power. It is important for Russia to be present at all the major decision-making forums, from the G20, BRICS, and the UN Security Council, up to the groups of 6 dealing with Iran, North Korea, the Middle Eastern Quartet, and the Syrian conflict resolution forums. 3. It is promoting the principles of diplomatic equality, reciprocity, and recognition of each other's interests in relations with the other great powers. With the United States, it is the nuclear parity and diplomatic parity in the United Nations Security Council and other decision-making arrangements. With NATO, it is equality and parity in establishing and management of the European security order. With the EU, it is a normative parity, parity in energy relations, and parity in building wider Europe. Fourth global priority is strengthening comprehensive bilateral and multilateral partnerships with China, India, and Brazil. As long as Russia is with them and is seen with them at the global arena, it justifies the Russian demands to be perceived and accepted as one of the rising great powers and poles of the multipolar system. And among them, of course, China is mostly important for Russia. China is for Russia and Russia is for China the friendliest among all the great powers. They need each other, and China needs Russia no less than Russia needs China. Their global positions and visions of the international order largely coincide. And regionally, Russia and China don't undermine each other, and their security concerns in Central Asia fully coincide. So these are basically global priorities of Russian foreign policy. Now let's move to the regional priorities. And of course, the first still will be Ukraine. The Russian purpose here is to prevent Ukraine's integration with the West and to prevent Ukraine's consolidation as the anti-Russian country. To convince the West to elaborate internal order in Ukraine and place that Ukraine will occupy in the European economic and security systems jointly with Russia. And this basically means full implementation of the Minsk agreements. Second Russian priority, regional priority, is Syria. The purpose here is to promote political resolution and strengthening of the US-Russian military and political cooperation. There is full understanding that eventually Bashar Assad will step down. But this should be a result of internal inclusive process in Syria, not a result of externally imposed conditions. Third regional priority is consolidation of the Eurasian Economic Union, its recognition by the other players, dialogues and trade regimes between the Eurasian Economic Union and the other countries, and integrationist arrangements, as well as strengthening of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Here, Russia, of course, faces certain challenges. On the one hand, Eurasian Economic Union is the reality, but on the other hand, its future is still unclear and there are many problems, such as members don't agree with each other upon the destination and pace of integration. Belarus and Kazakhstan pursue balancing policies in conditioning of the Russia-West relations and use Eurasian Economic Union as a leverage upon Russia, and so on and so forth. As for recognition of the Eurasian Economic Union and its integration into the wider framework, its trade agreement with China would be a game changer. As for a formal recognition of the Eurasian Economic Union by the European Union, it still remains unclear for the near future. The fourth regional priority is strengthening strategic partnership with China. China will remain the partner number one for Russia beyond post-Soviet space for the observable future. Fifth priority, creating Eurasian Comprehensive Partnership. Creating a new Eurasian economic and security architecture through enlarging Shanghai Cooperation Organization to India and Pakistan and forging coordinated development between Eurasian Economic Union and One Belt, One Road constitutes a very important priority of Russian foreign policy. Priority number 6, continuing Russia's pivot to Asia-Pacific beyond China. As the center of gravity in the world is moving to the Pacific, it would be stupid for Russia to stay away, especially as Russia needs to boost development of Siberia and Far East, which means deepening economic cooperation with Japan, Korea, ASEAN countries, and so on and so forth. With the European Union, Russia will try to use the Trump effect on the transatlantic ties to accelerate relations with the EU and EU member states. How much successful it will be in the near term, future remains of course unclear. Strategically, the EU and member states of the EU will have to diversify their security relations, as solidarity on the part of the United States will go down. But so far, they perceive Russia as the major security challenge. The United States, also a very important regional priority for Russia. Russia will be keeping very cautious optimism towards the United States and will still try to use the window of opportunities that Trump's presidency created. Some important contradictions in the US-Russian relations have already decreased due to certain changes in the Trump administration foreign policy. First, the Trump administration reduced the role of ideology and values in the US foreign policy. Secondly, they pursue a more narrow understanding of American national interests. Third, they don't want to increase containment of Russia in the post-Soviet space, and this creates certain opportunities. However, attempts of the American establishment to undermine Trump using Russia as the tool prevent any standing cooperation. Trump is unable to deliver upon anything towards Russia. All the contacts between Russia and Trump administration result in immediate scandals. And this, of course, prevents any normal interaction and normalization of relations. Moreover, as I already mentioned, it is likely that a new ideological backlash will happen after Trump. And those contradictions that so far have been diminished will rise again. And there is certainly an anti-Russian consensus in the US elite, in the establishment. So Russia is compelled to prepare itself for even further aggravation of US-Russian confrontation in the middle-term future, probably after 2020, which will have very serious negative implications for security in the post-Soviet space, Middle East, and European security in general. So maximum what is possible in the near-term future is management of confrontational relations with the United States, not overcoming of this confrontation. With NATO, NATO-Russia relations will usually follow the conjuncture of the US-Russia relations, and thus no fundamental improvement should be expected in the near-term future. Military build-up along the NATO-Russia flank in the Baltic and Black Sea regions will continue and might result in the new arms race. NATO-Russian counter-terrorism cooperation, be it Syria or Afghanistan, will remain to be very desired but very difficult to implement. And finally, in the Middle East, Russian priorities will be promoting Russia as the independent great power, balancing its relations with Iran and partnership with some Sunni states, above all Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and counter-terrorism through contribution to secular statehood in the countries of the region. This is why, for instance, Russia supports one of the sides of the conflict in Libya. This description of major priorities of Russian foreign policy again proves how realist Russia is a player and how Russia sees the world through the realist prism. If you want to study more details about the logic and the major trajectories of Russian foreign policy, please follow the reading list provided.